Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to support us. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city you're watching from. Now let's get into the case. Greg Thompson had been anticipating this hunting trip for months. Every November for the past 15 years, he and his hunting buddies gathered at their permanent camp near the Ottawa National Forest in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. This year was different though. Several of his usual companions had backed out due to family commitments or health issues, leaving only him and his longtime friend, Ray Donovan. While Greg initially felt disappointed by the smaller group, he secretly appreciated the quieter atmosphere. At 47, he'd begun to value solitude more than the raucous camaraderie that had defined their earlier trips. The drive from his home in Grand Rapids had taken nearly 7 hours, including stops for gas and supplies. Greg had loaded his Ford F-150 with more equipment than 2 men could possibly need for a week, an overcompensation perhaps for the reduced manpower. His wife Diane had watched him pack with a mixture of amusement and concern. After 23 years of marriage, she'd grown accustomed to his November disappearances, but never quite shook the worry that accompanied them. "Take care of yourself out there," she'd said that morning, pressing a thermos of coffee into his hands. Her eyes betrayed her true thoughts. Memories of Bill Erickson, a local man who'd had a heart attack on a similar trip 3 years back. His hunting partners had tried to drive him out, but the rugged terrain had slowed them down. By the time they reached the hospital in Marquette, Bill was gone. "Always do," Greg had replied with a reassuring smile. He kissed her goodbye and promised to call when he reached the cabin, assuming he could get service. Cell coverage was spotty at best in that part of the UP. As Greg maneuvered his truck down the familiar dirt road that led to their hunting cabin, the late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy of maple, birch, and pine. The trees had shed most of their leaves, creating a golden carpet on the forest floor. He spotted Ray's blue Chevrolet Silverado, already parked in the small clearing next to the cabin, a modest 2-bedroom structure that Greg's father had built in the late 1970s. The cabin had no running water, but featured a hand pump, a wood-burning stove, and solar panels that Ray had installed 5 years ago to power a few lights and charge their phones. Ray emerged from the cabin as Greg pulled up, his broad frame silhouetted against the wooden structure. At 52, Ray had maintained the physique of the college linebacker he once was, though his dark hair had begun to gray at the temples. He'd grown a beard for hunting season, a tradition he claimed helped him blend into the environment better, though Greg suspected it had more to do with laziness than camouflage. "About time you showed up," Ray called, walking toward the truck. "Thought I'd have to drag that buck back myself tomorrow." Greg laughed as he cut the engine. "In your dreams, Donovan. We both know who's got the better aim." The 2 men embraced briefly, then set about unloading Greg's truck. They worked efficiently, their movements reflecting years of shared experience. The supplies, food, ammunition, additional clothing, and hunting gear found their designated places inside the cabin or the small storage shed attached to it. By the time they finished, twilight had descended and the temperature had dropped. Greg could see his breath forming clouds in the increasingly chilly air. Inside, Ray had already stocked the wood stove, which now radiated welcome heat throughout the main room. The cabin's interior was exactly as Greg remembered it, knotty pine walls decorated with mounted antlers and framed photographs of hunting parties past, mismatched furniture that prioritized function over form, and the worn oak table where countless card games had been played and hunting stories embellished. "Beer?" Ray asked, pulling 2 bottles from a cooler. Greg accepted the offered drink and settled into his usual armchair. "So, what's the plan for tomorrow?" Ray sat across from him, taking a long swig from his bottle before answering. "I scouted a bit before you arrived. There's good sign about 2 miles northwest near the old logging road. Figured we'd head out before dawn, set up in the double stand." Greg nodded his approval. The double stand was a large, elevated hunting blind they'd built several seasons ago, strategically positioned overlooking a natural clearing that deer frequently traversed. It was comfortable enough for 2 grown men to sit quietly for hours, which was no small consideration. As they ate the simple dinner Ray had prepared, canned beef stew heated on the wood stove, they discussed strategies for the morning hunt, updates on mutual friends, and the respective achievements of their children. Ray's daughter had just started her freshman year at Michigan State, while Greg's son was finishing his master's degree in environmental science at the University of Minnesota. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by the crackling of the fire and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. By 9 o'clock, Both men were ready for sleep. The next day would start early, and the woods demanded alertness. Greg took the smaller of the two bedrooms, the one he'd used since he was a teenager, accompanying his father on these trips. The twin bed with its sagging mattress felt familiar and oddly comforting. Through the thin walls, he could hear Ray moving around, then the creak of the other bed frame as his friend settled in for the night. Greg set his alarm for 4:30 a.m., though he doubted he'd need it. Decades of hunting trips had conditioned his body to wake naturally before dawn in these surroundings. Still, he wasn't taking chances. This was their first day, and he intended to make the most of it. Sleep came quickly, deep and dreamless in the profound silence of the forest. The alarm proved unnecessary. Greg woke at 4:15, his body adhering to its internal hunting clock. He lay still for a moment, orienting himself in the darkness, listening to the subtle sounds of the cabin, the low moan of the wind outside, the occasional pop from the cooling wood stove. Then he rolled out of bed, pulled on his base layers, and padded to the main room. Ray was already there, heating water for coffee on the propane camp stove they used for morning preparations. They moved around each other with practiced ease, speaking little. Words seemed superfluous in these pre-dawn moments, as if they might somehow alert the deer to their presence, even miles away from their intended hunting ground. By 5 a.m., they were fully dressed in their hunting gear, insulated camouflage, coveralls, blaze orange vests, a legal requirement, boots, gloves, and hats. They'd eaten a substantial breakfast of instant oatmeal with dried fruit and nuts, protein bars, and black coffee. Their backpacks contained water, additional protein bars, jerky, and extra ammunition. Greg carried his Remington 700 bolt-action rifle, a .30-06 that had belonged to his father. Ray preferred his newer Browning X-Bolt in the same caliber. They left the cabin, locking it out of habit rather than necessity. The night was clear and cold, hovering around 28 degrees. Their headlamps cut narrow paths through the darkness as they made their way through the forest, following game trails and landmarks they knew by heart. Their boots crunched on the light dusting of snow that had fallen the previous evening, and their breath formed ghostly plumes in the beam of their lights. It took them nearly an hour to reach the double stand. They climbed up separately, securing their rifles before ascending the wooden ladder. Inside, they settled onto the bench seat, adjusting their positions for comfort during what could be a long wait. The interior of the blind was spacious enough for their gear, but designed to keep them close to the windows for clear shooting lanes in multiple directions. As they sat in silence, the forest gradually awakened around them. The eastern sky lightened almost imperceptibly at first, then with increasing boldness, transitioning from black to deep blue to a palette of pink and orange. With the growing light came the sounds: chickadees calling, a distant woodpecker drumming, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. By 7:30, they had full visibility of the clearing. The morning had warmed slightly, but not enough to create the scent-carrying thermals that might alert deer to their presence. Perfect hunting conditions. The first deer appeared just after 80. A young doe, cautious and alert, stepped delicately into the clearing. Greg and Ray remained motionless, their eyes the only part of them moving as they tracked her progress. She was followed by two more does, likely yearlings from her previous fawn crop. The men exchanged a glance but made no move toward their rifles. They were after a buck, preferably one large enough to justify the effort of processing and the space it would take in their freezers. The does browsed peacefully for nearly 20 minutes before something, perhaps a sound imperceptible to the humans, startled them. They raised their heads in unison, ears swiveling, then bounded back into the forest, white tails flashing. "Wind shift," Ray whispered, though they both knew the doe's departure might herald the arrival of a buck. They waited, patient as only experienced hunters can be. The morning stretched on, the sun climbing higher, burning away the thin ground fog that had developed during the night. They saw a few more does at a distance, and once a spike buck too young to consider harvesting. By noon, they decided to break for lunch. They ate quietly, still vigilant, but allowing themselves quiet conversation now that the prime morning hours had passed. "Not much movement today," Greg observed, uncapping his thermos of coffee. Ray shrugged. "Early in the season, they'll be more active as the rut intensifies." They were discussing whether to try a different location for the afternoon when Ray suddenly stiffened. 10 o'clock, he breathed. Greg slowly turned. His head, there partially obscured by a thicket of young pines, stood a magnificent buck. Even at this distance, they could see the impressive rack, at least an 8-pointer, possibly 10. The deer moved cautiously, stopping frequently to test the air, its muscular body tense with awareness. Ray, being on the left side of the blind, had the better angle. With glacial slowness, he raised his rifle, nestling the stock against his shoulder. Greg remained absolutely still, not even daring to blink. The buck moved forward one step then another, its hooves silent on the forest floor. Ray followed it with his scope, waiting for the perfect broadside presentation. When the deer stopped to browse on a low-hanging branch, exposing its vital chest area, Ray took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the stillness. The buck leaped, kicked, then crashed through the underbrush. The sound of breaking branches tracked its retreat for several seconds, then silence fell again. "Good hit?" Greg asked, though he'd seen the deer's reaction. "Felt right," Ray replied, already standing. "Looked like it hit just behind the shoulder." They waited the customary 15 minutes to allow the deer time to expire if the shot was fatal, though both men were anxious to begin tracking. When Ray finally checked his watch and nodded, they gathered their gear and descended from the blind. At the site where the buck had stood, they found clear evidence of a hit, bright red blood on the trampled vegetation, indicating a lung shot. The blood trail was steady and easy to follow, droplets and smears marking the deer's desperate flight. They tracked it for about 200 yards before finding the buck collapsed in a small clearing. It was indeed a 10-pointer, its antlers impressive both in spread and tine length. Ray approached it cautiously, rifle ready, but the animal was already dead, its eyes glazed and body still. "Beautiful animal," Greg said, as they stood over it. Ray nodded, a mixture of satisfaction and reverence in his expression. "Hate to say it, but I think this might be my best buck yet." The work began then, the field dressing that would preserve the meat until they could transport it back to the cabin. Ray, having made the kill, took point on the procedure. He removed his hunting knife from its sheath and made the initial incision while Greg held the deer's legs apart. They worked methodically, removing the internal organs with practiced efficiency, careful to avoid puncturing the stomach or intestines, which would taint the meat. As they worked, Greg kept glancing at his watch. It was already past 2, and field dressing, combined with the effort it would take to drag the buck back to the cabin, meant they'd likely be pushing darkness. The UP in November had notably short days, with the sun setting before 5 p.m. "We should have brought the game cart," he commented, as Ray finished emptying the body cavity. "Hindsight," Ray grunted, wiping his bloody hands on a rag. "Pretty. Sure we can manage between us, though. He's big, but not massive." They fashioned a drag pole using a sturdy branch, threading it through the deer's bound hind legs. With one man at each end, they began the laborious process of hauling the carcass back toward the cabin. The route that had taken an hour to walk that morning now stretched interminably before them, complicated by their heavy burden and the need to navigate around obstacles rather than over them. Progress was slow and exhausting. They stopped frequently to rest, switch positions, and drink water. The temperature, which had climbed into the low 40s at midday, began to drop again as the afternoon waned. Sweat cooled on their bodies during rest periods, making the subsequent exertion even more demanding. By the time they glimpsed the cabin through the trees, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Their shoulders ached from the strain of dragging, and both men were breathing heavily despite their general fitness. "Let's hang him on the processing rack tonight and deal with butchering tomorrow," Ray suggested as they approached the clearing around the cabin. Greg agreed readily. The processing rack, a sturdy gambrel suspended from a pulley system attached to a tall pine near the cabin, would keep the deer safe from predators overnight. They could begin the more detailed work of skinning and butchering after a night's rest. Using the pulley system, they hoisted the buck until it dangled head down about 7 feet off the ground, high enough to discourage scavengers. Ray secured the rope to a nearby tree, then stepped back to admire his trophy once more. "I'll grab the camera," he said. "Need to document this before we turn him into steaks and sausage." While Ray went inside for his digital camera, Greg walked around the suspended deer, examining it with a hunter's critical eye. It was indeed an impressive specimen, probably 5.5 years old, judging by its body size and antler development. The meat would be prime, not too tough from age, not too undeveloped from youth. Ray returned and took several photographs of the buck, including some with Greg standing alongside it and a few of himself with his prize. They'd post these on social media later, share them with their hunting club back home, add them to the album that chronicled their annual expeditions. With the buck secured, they finally entered the cabin, shedding their blood-stained outer layers on the porch. The interior felt blissfully warm after hours in the cooling forest. Ray stoked the wood stove, while Greg pulled 2 beers from the cooler. They'd earned these, and several more besides. To a successful hunt, Ray said, raising his bottle. And so to many more, Greg added, clinking his bottle against his friend's. They spent the evening in comfortable conversation, replaying the day's events, planning the next day's butchering, and discussing where they might hunt subsequently. With one tag filled, they'd focus on getting a deer for Greg, then perhaps try for a second if time and conditions permitted. That night, Greg slept the deep sleep of physical exhaustion, his muscles already anticipating the soreness that would greet him in the morning. The next day dawned overcast and noticeably colder. Greg's weather app, which he checked during a brief moment of cell service, predicted possible snow flurries later in the day. Perfect deer weather, as the approaching front would likely have them moving. After breakfast, they turned their attention to Ray's buck. The first task was skinning, a meticulous process that required concentration and a sharp knife. They worked together, Ray making the initial cuts while Greg helped pull the hide away from the flesh. The cold morning air kept flies at bay, though they worked efficiently nonetheless, aware that the meat quality depended on proper handling. With the hide removed and set aside, Ray planned to have it tanned as a memento. They began the butchering. This was where their partnership truly shined. Years of practice had honed their technique to near professional levels. They separated the large muscle groups, trimmed away fat and silver skin, and categorized each cut according to its eventual use: steaks, roast, stew meat, and trimmings for grinding into burger or sausage. By mid-morning, they had most of the major cuts processed and stored in the large cooler they'd brought specifically for this purpose. The remaining meat, primarily from the shoulders and neck, they would process after lunch. The temperature had dropped enough that they weren't concerned about spoilage, especially with the cooler placed in the shade on the north side of the cabin. "Want to try for your buck this afternoon?" Ray asked as they washed up. Greg considered the question. "Actually, I'm thinking we might have better luck tomorrow morning. Front's still moving in. Let's finish processing this one properly, then scout a bit this afternoon. I've got a feeling about that ridge east of the creek." Ray nodded his agreement. They finished cleaning their knives and cutting boards, then prepared a lunch of sandwiches using bread, cheese, and summer sausage they'd brought from home. As they ate, they discussed the best approach to the ridge Greg had mentioned, consulting a topographical map spread out on the table between them. "If we set up here," Greg said, pointing to a narrow saddle between two higher elevations, "we'll have good visibility down both sides. Deer often travel along that contour. Good wind direction too, assuming it stays from the northwest," Ray added. After lunch, they returned to the remaining butchering tasks. Ray focused on deboning the shoulder meat while Greg began grinding some of the trimmings for burger. They worked steadily, the routine familiar and almost meditative in its repetition. They were nearly finished when they heard the first unusual sound, a snuffling, rustling noise from the direction of the wood's edge nearest the cabin. Both men paused, knives in hand, listening intently. "Probably a raccoon or fox checking out the smell," Ray suggested after a moment of silence. Greg wasn't so sure. The noise had sounded heavier, more deliberate than a small scavenger would make. Still, with no further disturbance, they resumed their work, though Greg found himself glancing up more frequently, scanning the tree line. It was during one such scan that he spotted the bear. It emerged from between two large hemlock trees about 50 yards from where they worked, its black fur making it appear like a moving shadow against the forest backdrop. It was a good-sized black bear, probably a male given its bulk, though not enormous by UP standards. Perhaps 300 pounds. "Ray," Greg said quietly, nodding toward the animal. Ray looked up, his expression changing from concentration to alert concern as he spotted the bear. Neither man moved, watching as the bear lifted its head, obviously catching their scent or that of the deer carcass. "Should we get the rifles?" Ray whispered. Greg considered this. The rifles were inside the cabin, about 20 feet away. Bear season wasn't currently open, so shooting would only be justified in self-defense, and the animal hadn't shown any aggression yet. It was simply investigating, drawn by the irresistible scent of fresh meat. "Let's make some noise first, see if it spooks," Greg suggested. "We don't want trouble with the DNR over an unnecessary kill." Ray nodded. Together, they began to make themselves more visible, standing upright, raising their arms to appear larger. "Hey, bear!" Greg called loudly. "Get out of here!" The bear stopped, watching them with evident interest but not immediate fear. It rose briefly onto its hind legs, gaining height to better assess the situation, then dropped back to all fours. Rather than retreating, it took several steps forward, its movements purposeful. "It's not scared," Ray observed, a new tension in his voice. Greg felt his heart rate increasing. Black bears weren't typically aggressive toward humans, But a food-conditioned bear, one that associated human presence with easy meals, could be dangerously bold. And they were standing next to a significant food source. Back toward the cabin slowly, Greg directed, beginning to move sideways, keeping his eyes on the bear. Don't run! They edged away from the processing area, moving deliberately toward the cabin door. The bear, apparently encouraged by their retreat, continued its approach, now angling toward the deer remains hanging from the gambrel. If it just wants the deer, maybe we let it have it, Ray suggested. Greg was conflicted. The bear was trespassing into what they had established as their territory, and allowing it to feed would only reinforce its association of humans with food. On the other hand, confronting a bear was never without risk. They had reached the porch steps when the bear suddenly accelerated, not toward them, but toward the hanging deer. It rose again on its hind legs, reaching up toward the carcass that dangled just above its grasp. That's Ray's deer, Greg said, a flash of indignation overriding his caution. We worked hard for that meat. Before Ray could respond, Greg picked up a nearby piece of firewood and hurled it toward the bear, not aiming to hit it, but to land close enough to startle it. The wood clattered against a tree trunk near the bear, which dropped to all fours and whirled toward the source of the disturbance. For a moment, bear and humans regarded each other across 30 yards of clearing. Then, with surprising speed for an animal its size, the bear charged. Later, Greg would recall the next few seconds as a blur of adrenaline and instinct. The bear covered the ground between them with frightening rapidity, its focus seemingly fixed on Greg, who had thrown the wood. Ray shouted something and lunged for the cabin door, presumably going for a rifle. Greg, realizing he couldn't reach safety before the bear reached him, looked frantically for a weapon. His hand closed around the handle of his hunting knife, still bloody from the butchering. It was a pathetically inadequate defense against 300 pounds of muscle and claw, but it was all he had. He braced himself, knife extended, as the bear closed the final distance. The impact knocked him backward off the porch steps. He felt the breath driven from his lungs as he hit the ground, the bear's substantial weight pinning him. A wave of musky, wild odor engulfed him as the animal's head came close to his face. He caught a glimpse of amber eyes, wet black nose, yellowed teeth. Acting purely on survival instinct, Greg drove his knife toward the bear's neck. He felt it connect, sink into flesh, but not deeply enough to disable the animal. The bear roared, sound that seemed to vibrate through Greg's entire body, and swiped at him with a massive paw. Pain exploded across Greg's left arm as the bear's claws tore through his jacket and into the flesh beneath. He cried out, still struggling underneath the animal's weight, trying to bring the knife up for another strike. The bear's jaws snapped near his face, its hot breath washing over him. Greg twisted desperately, managing to partially free his right arm. He stabbed upward again, feeling the knife sink into the bear's shoulder. The animal bellowed in pain and rage, intensifying its attack. Greg felt another searing pain, this time across his chest, as claws ripped through clothing and skin. The world narrowed to a tunnel of agony and desperate struggle. He knew with sudden clarity that he might die here, mauled to death in a place he had always associated with peace and fulfillment. Then came the deafening crack of a rifle shot. The bear flinched violently but didn't immediately release him. Another shot rang out, and suddenly the crushing weight lifted. The bear staggered sideways, blood visible on its black fur, then turned and lumbered toward the forest edge with surprising speed despite its injuries. Ray appeared in Greg's field of vision, rifle still raised, tracking the retreating bear. "Greg! Jesus Christ, are you okay?" Greg couldn't immediately answer. His body felt simultaneously numb and on fire. He tried to sit up but found the movement excruciating. Looking down, he saw the torn fabric of his jacket and shirt, dark with spreading blood. His left arm hung awkwardly, and he couldn't seem to make his fingers respond. "Bad," he managed to say, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears. "I'm hurt bad, Ray." Ray was beside him now, face pale with shock. "Don't move. Let me see." He gently pulled away the shredded clothing to examine the wounds underneath. His sharp intake of breath told Greg everything he needed to know about their severity. "Need hospital," Greg said, finding it increasingly difficult to form coherent thoughts. The initial shock was wearing off, allowing pain to flood in. It radiated from his arm and chest in pulsing waves that threatened to overwhelm his consciousness. "I know, buddy. I know." Ray was already pulling off his own jacket, then his flannel shirt, which he pressed against the worst of the chest wounds. "Can you hold this here? I need to get the truck ready." Greg nodded, using his right hand to maintain pressure on the makeshift bandage. The effort required to remain upright and focused seemed monumental. He watched as Ray sprinted to his truck, started the engine, then ran back to the cabin, emerging moments later with their emergency kit and an old blanket. "Going to get you into the truck now," Ray said, returning to Greg's side. "This is going to hurt, but we have to move fast." With Ray's assistance, Greg managed to stand, though the movement sent fresh waves of agony through his body. He swayed dangerously, his vision tunneling, but Ray's strong arm around his waist kept him upright. Together, they shuffled toward the waiting vehicle, each step an exercise in endurance. Getting into the passenger seat was a new lesson in pain. Greg couldn't suppress a cry as the movement pulled at his torn flesh. Once he was seated, Ray quickly wrapped the blanket around him, then secured a more substantial pressure bandage to the chest wounds using supplies from the emergency kit. "Hang on," Ray said, closing the passenger door and rushing around to the driver's side. "Marquette's the closest real hospital, going to be a rough ride." As Ray backed the truck around and began navigating the rugged access road, Greg fought to stay conscious. He knew that giving in to the darkness edging his vision would be dangerous. Blood loss, shock, the onset of hypothermia, all real possibilities. That could kill him before they reached medical help. "Talk to me, Greg," Ray urged, dividing his attention between the treacherous road and his injured friend. "Stay with me, buddy." "The bear," Greg managed. "Did you kill it?" "No, just hit it. Aimed to scare it off, not for a kill shot. Didn't want to take the time for a follow-up. Getting you help was more important." Greg nodded, or thought he did. His perceptions were becoming increasingly unreliable. The truck jounced over ruts in the road, each impact sending fresh spasms of pain through his body. He tried to focus on breathing, shallow but steady, and on Ray's voice as his friend maintained a steady stream of encouragement and updates. Almost to the main road. 20 minutes to Sydnor, then straight shot to Marquette. Called 911, but service cut out. They'll have gotten the location, though. Might meet an ambulance on the way. The words washed over Greg, meaningful but increasingly distant. He concentrated instead on the physical sensations that anchored him to consciousness, the pressure of the seat against his back, the rough texture of the blanket against his good hand, the taste of copper in his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue during the attack. When they finally reached the paved road, the smoother surface was both a relief and a new concern, the increased speed amplifying Greg's awareness of how far they still had to travel. Ray drove faster now, clearly exceeding the speed limit, one hand on the wheel while the other occasionally reached over to check Greg's condition. "How you doing?" Ray asked for what might have been the dozenth time. "Still here," Greg replied, his voice weaker than before. "Arms numb now." Ray's expression tightened with worry. "That could be shock. Try to stay warm. Keep talking." Greg tried to comply, but forming coherent sentences required increasingly Herculean effort. Instead, he focused on the passing landscape, the familiar forests and occasional clearings that had featured in so many of his hunting trips. They had been driving for perhaps 40 minutes when they encountered the first sign of emergency response, a county sheriff's vehicle approaching from the opposite direction. Ray flashed his lights and honked, and the patrol car immediately executed a U-turn, lights activating. Rather than pulling them over, the deputy fell in behind them, essentially providing an escort. "See that?" Ray said, relief evident in his voice. "They're on it. Not much further now." The deputy's presence seemed to galvanize Ray, who drove with renewed intensity. When they crested a hill and saw the flashing lights of an ambulance ahead at a crossroads, Greg felt a surge of hope beneath the growing fog of his consciousness. Ray slowed and pulled alongside the waiting ambulance. Within moments, the vehicle was surrounded by emergency medical personnel. The passenger door opened, questions firing rapidly. "Bear attack. About an hour ago. Lacerations to left arm and chest. He's lost a lot of blood, going into shock, I think." Greg allowed himself to be transferred from the truck to a gurney, the movement triggering fresh waves of pain that nearly sent him into unconsciousness. New hands worked over him, cutting away the remaining clothing, attaching monitors, establishing an IV line. "Sir, can you hear me?" A paramedic's face appeared in his narrowing field of vision. "Can you tell me your name?" "Greg Thompson," he managed. "Bear got me." "Yes, sir, we understand. We're going to take care of you now. You're going to be okay." Greg wasn't sure he believed that, but he surrendered to their care nonetheless. As they loaded him into the ambulance, he caught a final glimpse of Ray standing beside his blood-stained truck, looking simultaneously relieved and terrified. Then the ambulance doors closed, and the vehicle began to move, sirens wailing. The next several hours existed for Greg as a series of fragmented impressions. The ambulance interior with its ceiling of equipment and supplies, the paramedic constantly checking his vital signs, maintaining a running commentary to keep him engaged. the burn of additional medication entering his system through the IV, the gradual transformation of raw pain into something more distant, though still present. He had no clear memory of arriving at the hospital in Marquette, though he later pieced together that they had met a medical helicopter en route, which had then transported him the final distance. His next concrete memory was of the operating room. Bright lights, masked faces, the peculiar detachment that came with significant anesthesia, significant tissue damage, reconstructive work on the deltoid, several deep lacerations requiring internal and external sutures, no apparent organ damage, blood transfusion proceeding, prophylactic antibiotics. The medical jargon filtered through his consciousness without fully registering. More meaningful was the absence of the all-consuming pain that had dominated his awareness since the attack. Even in his semi-conscious state, this relief felt profound. When Greg next achieved full consciousness, he was in a hospital room. Daylight filtered through partially closed blinds, suggesting morning or afternoon. He lay still for a moment, taking inventory. His left arm was heavily bandaged and immobilized against his body. His chest felt tight, restricted by what he assumed were more bandages. An IV ran into his right arm, and various monitoring equipment surrounded the bed. "There he is," Ray's voice came from beside the bed. "Welcome back, buddy." Greg turned his head to see his friend sitting in a visitor's chair, looking exhausted but relieved. "How long?" Greg asked, his voice raspy from disuse. "About 18 hours since the surgery. It's Wednesday morning. Attack was Monday afternoon." Greg absorbed this information slowly. "Bad? Bad enough. Doctor said you were lucky. The chest wounds looked worse than they were. No major organs hit. Your arm took the brunt of it. Some muscle damage they had to repair, but with physical therapy they expect full recovery." Greg nodded slightly, wincing at the pain the small movement caused. "The bear?" Ray shook his head. "DNR's looking, but no sign yet. I hit it definitely, but not a killing shot. It could be miles away by now." Before Greg could respond, a doctor entered the room. Dr. Melissa Chen, according to her ID badge, was a compact woman in her 40s, with an efficient manner that somehow managed to convey compassion as well. "Mr. Thompson, good to see you awake. I'm Dr. Chen. I led your surgical team yesterday." She moved to the bedside, checking the monitors before addressing him directly. "How's your pain level on a scale of 1 to 10? Greg considered this. 6, maybe 7. She nodded. "That's to be expected. We'll adjust your medication. You sustained significant injuries, but you were fortunate in several respects." She proceeded to explain his wounds in detail. 4 major lacerations to the chest, none penetrating to vital organs. Severe lacerations and tissue damage to the left arm, particularly the deltoid and bicep muscles. Various minor cuts and substantial bruising throughout his upper body. "We've repaired the muscle damage, and while you'll need physical therapy, we anticipate a good recovery." The chest wounds were primarily flesh wounds, painful and dramatic looking, but less severe than they might have been. "You lost a considerable amount of blood, which necessitated transfusion, and we're watching closely for signs of infection." "When can I go home?" Greg asked, already uncomfortable with the hospital environment. Dr. Chen smiled slightly. "Not for at least 3 or 4 days. We need to monitor those wounds, ensure there's no infection development, and get you started on initial physical therapy. Bear attacks carry a high risk of infection. Their claws harbor numerous bacteria. You're on powerful antibiotics now, and we'll need to see how those work before discharging you." Greg accepted this reluctantly. Dr. Chen checked his wounds, made notes in his chart, and adjusted his pain medication before leaving. The new dose soon took effect, wrapping him in a cocoon of artificial comfort that made his eyelids heavy. "You should rest," Ray said, noticing his struggle to stay awake. "I called Diane last night. She's on her way up, should be here this afternoon." The mention of his wife sent a pang of guilt through Greg. "She's going to kill me." Ray chuckled. "Pretty sure she'll wait until you're healed first. Get some sleep, buddy. I'll be here." Greg allowed himself to drift off, the medication pulling him down into dreamless sleep. When he next woke, the light had changed, and Ray had been replaced by Diane. His wife sat in the visitor's chair, her attention focused on a magazine in her lap. She looked up as he stirred, her expression a complex mixture of relief, concern, and the particular exasperation she reserved for situations where he had put himself in danger. "Hey," he said softly. Diane set aside the magazine and moved to the edge of the bed. "Hey yourself, bear wrestler." Despite the attempt at humor, her voice trembled slightly. "Sorry," Greg offered, knowing the word was wholly inadequate. She took his right hand in both of hers. "Ray told me what happened. Said you were trying to protect the deer you'd shot. Sounds stupid when you say it like that, A little bit, yes, she smiled faintly, but very you, always protecting what's yours. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what might have happened hanging between them. Greg knew she was imagining the alternative outcome, the phone call from Ray that would have destroyed rather than merely frightened her. Doctor says you'll recover, Diane said finally. But it's going to be a long process. Greg nodded. I figured, how bad do I look? Like you lost a fight with a bear. She squeezed his hand. Which, technically, you did. The scratches on your face aren't too deep. They probably won't scar much. The rest is covered in bandages, but Ray said it was pretty bad. I don't remember all of it, Greg admitted. Parts are clear, others are just sensation, pain mostly. Diane's composure faltered briefly. When Ray called, when he said bear attack, I thought. She stopped, collecting herself. Well, it doesn't matter what I thought. You're going to be okay, that's what matters. The conversation drifted to practical matters, how long he might be in the hospital, arrangements for his return home, the work he would miss during recovery. Diane had already contacted his employer, a construction management firm where Greg worked as a project superintendent. His boss had assured her that his job was secure and that they would accommodate his recovery needs. As they talked, Greg found himself thinking about the bear. Despite his injuries, despite the terror of the attack, he couldn't summon any hatred for the animal. It had been acting according to its nature, drawn by the scent of meat, responding to what it perceived as a threat. The fact that he had survived was largely due to Ray's quick action, not any failing on the bear's part as a predator. A DNR officer visited later that afternoon. Officer Martinez was a stocky man in his 30s with a matter-of-fact demeanor and a notebook full of questions. He took Greg's statement about the attack, occasionally interrupting for clarification. So you threw the piece of wood near the bear, not at it, he confirmed. Near it, Greg said. I wasn't trying to hurt it, just scare it off. Martinez nodded, making a note. And your friend, Mr. Donovan, fired 2 shots after the attack began. Not before. Definitely after. I was already on the ground. The officer continued through his questions, building a detailed picture of the incident. When he had finished, he closed his notebook and regarded Greg with professional sympathy. We've had reports of a problematic bear in that general area before. Based on your description, adult male, approximately 300 pounds, it might be the same animal. We've got teams out looking, but so far, no sign. Mr. Donovan said he hit it, but we haven't found a blood trail. What happens if you find it? Greg asked. Given the nature of the attack and the bear's apparent habituation to humans, it would likely be euthanized. Bears that associate people with food sources often become increasingly bold and dangerous. Greg felt a twinge of regret at this. It was just following its instincts. Officer Martinez nodded. True, but once a bear loses its natural wariness of humans, it's a public safety issue. We try relocation first with problem bears, but after an attack this serious, he shrugged. Policy is pretty clear. After the officer left, Greg settled back against his pillows, fatigue washing over him. The conversation, brief as it had drained his limited energy. Diane, noticing his exhaustion, encouraged him to rest. As he drifted towards sleep again, his mind returned to the moment of the attack, the bear's weight pinning him down, the amber eyes so close to his face, the primal fear that had coursed through him. The next few days established a new routine of medical checks, pain management, wound care, and the first tentative steps toward physical therapy. Dr. Chen visited daily, as did a succession of specialists, an infectious disease consultant, a physical therapist, a plastic surgeon who assessed the facial lacerations and pronounced them likely to heal with minimal scarring. Ray returned to the hunting cabin briefly to secure their equipment and belongings, then checked into a nearby hotel. He visited daily, filling the hours with conversation and quiet companionship when Greg was too tired or uncomfortable to talk. Diane remained in Marquette as well, dividing her time between the hospital and arrangements for their eventual return home. On Friday, 4 days after the attack, Officer Martinez returned with news. We found the bear, he announced without preamble. About 5 miles from your cabin site, dead in a ravine. The gunshot wounds were a contributing factor, but not the primary cause of death. Your knife wounds were actually more significant. One penetrated deeply near the jugular. It likely bled out fairly quickly after leaving the scene. Greg absorbed this information with mixed emotions, relief that the bear wouldn't threaten others, regret for the death of a wild creature that had only been following its nature. We'll need your hunting knife for evidence processing, Martinez continued. Standard procedure for wildlife attacks. You'll get it back eventually, though it might be a while. It's still at the cabin, I think, Greg said, unless Ray brought it back. He mentioned that. We'll collect it from him. This concludes our investigation from the DNR perspective. The attack has been classified as defensive, provoked by proximity to food sources. No charges or citations will be issued. After the officer left, Greg sat quietly, processing the news. The bear was dead, partly from wounds he had inflicted in desperate self-defense. It seemed a hollow victory at best. "You okay?" Diane asked, noting his silence. "Yeah, just thinking that neither of us wanted that encounter. The bear was just being a bear, I was just being stubborn. That's nature," she said simply. "Wild things do what they do, so do stubborn men." On Saturday, a week after he and Ray had arrived at the hunting cabin with such anticipation, Greg was discharged from the hospital. His left arm remained immobilized in a sling that would be necessary for at least 4 weeks. The chest wounds had been downgraded from severe to moderate, though they would require ongoing care. He left with prescriptions for antibiotics, pain management, and detailed instructions for wound care. The drive back to Grand Rapids was long and uncomfortable, despite the reclining passenger seat in Diane's SUV and the medication that dulled the worst of the pain. They stopped frequently, both for Greg's comfort and to break up the journey. Ray followed in his own vehicle, having insisted on seeing them safely home before returning to his own family in Lansing. That evening, settled into his own home for the first time since the attack, Greg found himself simultaneously relieved and disoriented. The familiar surroundings felt slightly unreal after the intensity of his experience. His body, weakened by trauma and medication, moved through the house like a foreign object. Newly awkward in spaces he had navigated with unconscious ease for decades. After dinner, a simple meal that Diane prepared while Ray regaled their teenage daughter Emma with a somewhat sanitized version of the bear encounter, Greg retreated to the living room sofa. The medication was making him drowsy again, but he resisted sleep, wanting to remain in this moment of normalcy as long as possible. Ray joined him while Diane and Emma cleaned up in the kitchen. "So," his friend said, settling into the adjacent armchair, "quite a hunting trip." Greg managed a small smile. "One for the record books, I guess. Not sure the guys at the club are going to believe it without evidence. Hence all those hospital pictures you took?" Ray grinned. "Exactly, nothing like documentation of horrific injuries to liven up the club meetings." His expression sobered. "Seriously though, you scared the hell out of me, Greg. When I came out of that cabin and saw you under that bear, you saved my life," Greg said simply. "I'd be dead if you hadn't been there." Ray shrugged uncomfortably. "You'd have done the same." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of shared experience between them. Finally, Ray spoke again. "So, next November?" The question hung in the air, ostensibly simple but laden with implications. Would Greg return to hunting? Would he go back to the same cabin? Would the experience change their annual tradition? Greg considered his answer carefully. The attack had been traumatic, certainly, but it hadn't fundamentally altered his love for the woods or the hunt. What it had done was remind him forcefully of his own vulnerability in wild places, a lesson he suspected he had needed. "Next November," he said slowly, "we follow proper bear country protocols. Food storage, meat processing away from camp. No scents that might attract unwanted visitors. We stay alert, carry bear spray, and we remember that we're guests in their territory." Ray studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Sounds like a plan. Though maybe we bring a few more guys next time. Safety in numbers and all that." Agreed. Greg shifted carefully, trying to find a more comfortable position for his bandaged chest. "And Ray, thanks. Not just for, for everything. After. Staying, helping with Diane, all of it." Ray waved this away. "That's what friends are for. Using their superior medical knowledge to keep your stubborn ass alive when you decide to take on apex predators bare-handed." Greg laughed, then immediately regretted it as pain flared across his chest. "Don't make me laugh, you jerk. It hurts." Ray departed the next morning after extracting promises from Greg to follow medical instructions and to call if he needed anything. The following weeks established a new routine centered around recovery. Greg's days were structured by medication, schedules, physical therapy appointments, wound care, and the gradual expansion of activities as his body healed. The chest lacerations improved steadily, the skin knitting together under the careful attention of Greg and Diane. The arm injuries proved more stubborn, the damaged muscles slow to regain strength and flexibility, despite his diligent adherence to the therapy regimen. The physical therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Brenda, pushed him hard but intelligently, balancing the need for progress against the risk of re-injury. 2 weeks after returning home, Greg received a call from Officer Martinez with an update. The bear's necropsy had confirmed earlier findings. It had died primarily from blood loss, resulting from the knife wound to the neck, with the gunshot wounds as contributing factors. Analysis of stomach contents revealed recent consumption of human food waste, suggesting the animal had indeed been habituated to human-associated food sources before the encounter at the cabin. Just confirms what we suspected, Martinez concluded. A food-conditioned bear that had lost its natural wariness of humans, these cases rarely end well for either party. The call left Greg thoughtful. Perhaps the encounter had been inevitable in some way, the confluence of a bear seeking easy meals and humans processing game meat in bear country without adequate precautions. He resolved to share his experience and the lessons learned from it, hoping to prevent similar incidents in the future. An opportunity arose sooner than expected. In late November, as Greg was beginning to transition from active recovery to more normal activities, he received an invitation to speak at the monthly meeting of his hunting club. The president, Jim Halverson, called personally. "Heard about your adventure from Ray," Jim said. "Thought the members might benefit from hearing it firsthand, especially the safety aspects. We've got a lot of guys who hunt the UP without necessarily considering bear encounters. Your experience could be valuable." Greg agreed readily. Preparing for the talk gave him purpose during the ongoing recovery process. He researched bear behavior and attack statistics, proper food storage techniques in bear country, and recommended safety measures for hunters. He incorporated these into his personal narrative, crafting a presentation that he hoped would be both engaging and educational. The hunting club met in the community room of a local sporting goods store. On the designated evening, Greg arrived, early, still moving somewhat stiffly, but no longer requiring the sling for his left arm. About 30 members were present, ranging from teenagers on their first hunting seasons to veterans in their 70s with decades of experience. Ray sat in the front row, offering silent moral support. When introduced, Greg moved to the small podium, suddenly aware of the attention focused on him. Public speaking had never been his forte, but the importance of his message overrode his discomfort. "Most of you know me," he began. "I've been a member here for 12 years. What you might not know is that earlier this month, I had an encounter with a black bear in the Ottawa National Forest that nearly killed me." He proceeded to tell his story, unvarnished but not sensationalized. He described the initial sighting of the bear, the decision to try to scare it away rather than retreat, and the terrifying moments of the attack itself. He acknowledged his error in judgment, confronting the bear rather than allowing it to take the deer carcass, and the devastating consequences of that decision. "I'm standing here today because my hunting partner, Ray Donovan, kept his head in a crisis," Greg said, nodding toward his friend. "He drove me nearly an hour to meet emergency services, and that quick action saved my life. But the entire situation could have been avoided with better preparation and decision-making." He then transitioned to the educational portion of his talk, outlining best practices for hunting in bear country. He emphasized proper food and scent management, the importance of being aware of one's surroundings, appropriate responses to bear sightings, and the value of carrying bear deterrents such as spray or noisemakers. "Bears aren't malicious," he concluded. "They're wild animals following their instincts. The one that attacked me was likely conditioned to associate human activity with food opportunities. Our responsibility as hunters, as users of wild spaces, is to minimize our impact and avoid creating dangerous situations for ourselves and the wildlife we share these spaces with." The presentation was met with attentive silence, followed by numerous questions. Had he seen signs of the bear before the attack? Did he think bear spray would have deterred it? How had the incident changed his approach to hunting? Greg answered each question honestly, neither downplaying the danger nor exaggerating his own role in the encounter. After the formal session ended, several members approached him individually, sharing their own, thankfully less dramatic, bear encounters and discussing specific safety measures. One older hunter, Frank Wilcox, seemed particularly affected by the presentation. "Been hunting the UP for 30 years, Frank told him. "Seen plenty of bears, but always at a distance. Never gave much thought to what I'd do if one got aggressive. Your talks got me thinking." These individual conversations proved as valuable as the formal presentation, creating opportunities for nuanced discussion of wilderness safety that might have been overlooked in the larger forum. By the time Greg and Ray left the meeting, several members had committed to reviewing their own hunting practices and equipment for the next season. In the car afterward, Ray seemed thoughtful. "You did good in there, made an impression." Greg shrugged. wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his still healing chest. "I hope so. If it prevents even one similar incident, it's worth it. Thinking about taking this show on the road, there are other clubs, community groups that might benefit." The suggestion surprised Greg, but he found himself considering it seriously. "Maybe. Let me get through the full recovery first, but yeah, could be worthwhile." The weeks continued to pass. December arrived with the first substantial snowfall of the season, transforming the neighborhood into a winter landscape that reminded Greg forcefully of the hunting cabin. He sometimes caught himself staring out the window, mind returning to those crucial moments: the bear's approach, the decision to confront rather than retreat, the chaotic struggle that followed. These episodes weren't exactly flashbacks in the clinical sense, but they were vivid enough to momentarily disconnect him from his present surroundings. Diane noticed, of course, one evening finding him standing at the back door gazing into the snowy yard. She gently suggested he might benefit from talking to someone professionally. "I'm fine," he assured her. "Just processing." "Processing is good," she agreed. "But sometimes having guidance through that process is better. There's no weakness in getting help, Greg." He considered her words, recognizing the wisdom in them. The physical wounds were healing well. The chest lacerations had closed completely, leaving pink scars that would gradually fade to white. The arm had regained perhaps 70% of its former strength and range of motion, with continued improvement expected. The psychological impact was harder to quantify, manifesting in occasional restless nights, heightened startle responses, and these moments of mental return to the attack. In early January, Greg began seeing a therapist specializing in trauma recovery. Dr. Morgan was a calm, thoughtful man who approached Greg's experience with neither clinical detachment nor excessive emotionality. Their sessions focused on integrating the attack into Greg's broader life narrative without allowing it to become defining. These types of encounters often challenge our fundamental sense of security, Dr. Morgan observed during their second session, particularly for someone like yourself who has spent significant time in wilderness environments without previous threat. Greg nodded. "I always respected the wilderness, but I never really feared it. Now, it's complicated. That complexity is natural. The goal isn't to eliminate it, but to find a healthy relationship with it, acknowledging the legitimate dangers without allowing them to restrict your life unnecessarily." These conversations proved unexpectedly valuable, providing Greg with frameworks to understand his own responses and techniques to manage intrusive thoughts when they occurred. He found himself more able to discuss the attack without emotional flooding, to analyze his decisions objectively without excessive self-recrimination. Meanwhile, his physical recovery continued to progress. By February, he had returned to work on a part-time basis, managing projects from the office while gradually reintegrating into site visits as his stamina improved. Colleagues were supportive but not overly solicitous, for which Greg was grateful. The last thing he wanted was to be treated as fragile or damaged. The invitation to share his experience expanded beyond the hunting club. A local community college requested a presentation for their wilderness safety course. A regional hunting and fishing exposition offered him a slot in their seminar schedule. A conservation organization working on human-wildlife conflict resolution asked him to participate in a panel discussion. Greg accepted each opportunity, refining his presentation based on audience feedback and continued research. In March, as the landscape began to hint at spring, Greg received an unexpected communication, an email from a wildlife biologist named Sarah Thornton, who had read about his experience in a DNR internal report. "I'm conducting research on human-bear encounters in the upper Midwest," she wrote. "Your case has several elements of particular interest to our study. Would you be willing to discuss it in more detail? Your insights could contribute significantly to our understanding of these interactions and potentially to improved safety guidelines." After a brief email exchange, they arranged a video call. Dr. Thornton proved to be a passionate researcher in her mid-30s with an impressive background in carnivore behavior studies. Her questions were detailed and specific, focusing not just on the attack itself, but on the preceding and following events. What attractants might have been present, how the bear had behaved before becoming aggressive, the effectiveness of various deterrent attempts. "One thing that stands out in your case," she noted, "is the bear's initial boldness. Many black bears would have retreated when confronted by two adult humans making noise. This suggests a high degree of habituation, consistent with the food residue found in the necropsy. So it might have encountered hunters before, or campers?" Greg asked. Very possibly. Once bears associate human presence with food rewards, each successful raid reinforces the behavior. They're incredibly intelligent animals with excellent memory and problem-solving abilities. Their conversation extended well beyond the scheduled time, ranging from specific safety recommendations for hunters to broader issues of wildlife management in increasingly human-impacted environments. By the end, Dr. Thornton had invited Greg to contribute to a guide she was developing for outdoor recreationists in bear country. Your perspective as someone who's experienced an attack firsthand adds a dimension that scientific data alone can't provide, she explained, and your ability to discuss it without demonizing the bear is particularly valuable. Greg agreed to review draft materials and provide input based on his experience. The collaboration gave him a sense of purpose, a way to derive meaning from an event that might otherwise have remained simply traumatic. As spring fully arrived, Greg found himself increasingly drawn to outdoor activities again. He began with short fishing expeditions to local lakes, then progressed to day hikes in state parks. Each excursion helped rebuild his confidence in wild settings, though he remained hyper-vigilant, especially in more remote areas. He carried bear spray now as a matter of course, even in locations where encounters were extremely unlikely. Diane accompanied him on many of these outings, her presence both practical support and emotional reassurance. They had always enjoyed outdoor recreation together, but these post-attack expeditions took on a new significance, reclamations of shared joy that the bear encounter might have diminished. In June, nearly 8 months after the attack, Greg received a call from Ray. "So," his friend began without preamble, "I'm making reservations for November. Same cabin. You in?" The question shouldn't have surprised Greg, yet it did. Despite all his progress, despite the educational presentations and therapeutic discussions, he hadn't consciously considered whether he would return to the hunting cabin. The prospect generated immediate physical responses, a quickened heartbeat, a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his healed wounds. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "Haven't thought about it specifically." "Take your time," Ray said. "No pressure. But I think it would be good for you, full circle and all that, and we'd have proper protocols in place this time. Bear-proof containers, processing area well away from the sleeping cabin, the works. Let me talk to Diane and think about it." That evening after dinner, Greg raised the subject with his wife. Her initial expression was guarded, but she listened without interruption as he explained Ray's invitation and his own conflicted response. "Part of me wants to go," he concluded, "to not let what happened change everything. But another part, I don't know if I'm ready to be in that exact place again." Diane considered her response carefully. "I think you need to decide what constitutes healing for you," she said finally. "For some people it might mean going back, facing the place where it happened. For others, it might mean finding new places, new traditions. There's no universal right answer. What do you think I should do?" "I think," she said, taking his hand, "that you should trust yourself to know what you need. You've been working hard on recovery, both physical and mental. You've turned your experience into something educational for others. Whatever you decide about the cabin, it won't undo any of that progress." Her perspective gave him permission to examine his own feelings more honestly. Over the next several days, he found himself mentally revisiting the cabin, the surrounding forest, the specific clearing where the attack had occurred. The images no longer triggered the same visceral fear response they once had. Instead, they seemed more like scenes from a movie he had watched rather than experienced, still vivid, but less emotionally charged. After a week of reflection, Greg called Ray back. "I'm in," he said simply. "You sure?" Ray sounded simultaneously, pleased and concerned. "Don't want you doing this if you're not ready. I'm sure, but we do it right this time. All the proper precautions, and maybe we invite a couple more guys. Safety in numbers." "Already on it," got Tom and Mike confirmed. "If you're in, 4 is a good number." The decision made, Greg felt a surprising sense of peace. The return to the cabin would be a deliberate choice rather than an avoidance, a reclaiming of something valuable rather than a surrender to fear. The remainder of the summer and early fall passed quickly, filled with work, family activities, and continued collaboration with Dr. Thornton on the bear safety materials. Greg's physical recovery had plateaued at about 90% of his pre-attack capabilities. The arm would likely never regain its full former strength, and certain movements remained restricted. The scars had faded to silvery lines across his chest and arm, visible but no longer angry-looking. In October, he participated in a public information session organized by the DNR focusing on bear awareness for hunters and hikers. The event drew a larger crowd than expected, suggesting growing interest in wildlife safety issues. Greg shared the platform with Officer Martinez and a bear management specialist, each offering different perspectives on human-wildlife interactions. During the Q&A period, a young woman raised her hand. "After what happened to you?" she asked Greg. "Aren't you afraid to go back into areas with bears?" "I think I'd be terrified." The question was straightforward but profound. Greg considered it carefully before responding. "I respect bears more now, certainly. I prepare differently, act differently in bear country, but afraid? No, not in the disabling sense. What I experienced was extraordinarily rare, even with the mistakes I made. The wilderness still offers more joy than danger if we approach it mindfully." As November approached, Greg found himself anticipating the hunting trip with a complex mixture of emotions: excitement, apprehension, determination, nostalgia. He prepared meticulously, reviewing the bear safety protocols he had helped develop, assembling additional equipment including a bear-proof food container and high-quality bear spray. He discussed the upcoming trip with Dr. Morgan, who helped him develop specific strategies for managing anxiety if it arose during the visit. The weekend before the scheduled departure, Greg drove alone to a state game area about an hour from Grand Rapids. The property featured several hiking trails through varied terrain, including dense forest similar to that surrounding the hunting cabin. He spent the day there, initially hyper-vigilant but gradually relaxing into the familiar rhythms of the woods, the sound of wind through the remaining leaves, the movement of small wildlife, the particular quality of light filtering through the canopy. At one point, he deliberately sat still on a fallen log for nearly an hour, allowing his senses to attune fully to his surroundings. The exercise proved both calming and affirming. This was still his element, still a place where he felt fundamentally at home despite what had happened. The bear attack had changed him, certainly, but it hadn't severed his connection to wild places. On the designated Wednesday morning, Greg loaded his gear into his truck, kissed Diane goodbye, and headed north to meet Ray, Tom, and Mike at their traditional rendezvous point just south of the Mackinac Bridge. The familiar drive gave him time to process his thoughts, to prepare mentally for returning to the site of the attack. When he spotted Ray's blue truck in the restaurant parking lot, a wave of anticipation washed over him. The four men greeted each other with the easy camaraderie of long association, catching up over breakfast before continuing the journey north in a two-vehicle convoy. As they drove through the increasingly remote landscape of the Upper Peninsula, Greg found himself watching the forest more intently than in previous years, scanning the tree line not just for deer, but for any larger movement. Yet the hypervigilance didn't feel pathological, more like an appropriate awareness, a realistic assessment of his environment. They reached the cabin in mid-afternoon, the scene so familiar that Greg experienced a moment of dissonance. It looked exactly as it always had: the weathered wooden structure, the clearing with its fire pit, the tall pines surrounding the property. Only the newly installed bear-proof storage locker and the designated meat processing area, established well away from the sleeping quarters, indicated any change from previous years. Greg stood by his truck for a moment, absorbing the sight, allowing the memories to surface without resistance. The attack had happened there, near where Mike was now unloading coolers from his vehicle. The bear had emerged from the forest edge, just beyond where Tom was gathering kindling for the evening fire. Ray had shot from approximately where he now stood, organizing gear on the cabin porch. "You good?" Ray asked quietly, coming to stand beside him. Greg nodded. "Yeah, different than I expected. It's just the cabin, our place." They proceeded with the usual setup activities, bringing in supplies, preparing beds, checking equipment for the next day's hunt. The familiar routine helped normalize the experience, transforming the location back from attack site to hunting camp. The other men, aware of Greg's history with the place but taking cues from his matter-of-fact demeanor, treated the situation with similar normalcy. That evening, as they sat around the fire pit discussing plans for the morning hunt, Tom raised his beer bottle in Greg's direction. "Got to say, man, I wasn't sure you'd come back here after what happened. Takes guts." Greg shrugged, uncomfortable with the implied heroism. "Just didn't want to let one bad experience ruin 15 years of good ones." "Still," Mike added, "not everyone would make the same choice. Worth acknowledging." Later, as Greg lay in his familiar twin bed, listening to the night sounds of the forest through the partially open window, he reflected on the day. The return had been easier in some ways than anticipated, harder in others. The physical location held less emotional charge than he had feared, but the constant low-level alertness was more taxing than he had expected. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by both normal hunting camp disturbances, Ray's snoring from the next room, the creak of the cabin settling, and by his own heightened awareness. Yet when his alarm sounded at 4:30 a.m., he felt surprisingly refreshed, eager for the day ahead. The morning unfolded according to their carefully considered plan. The four men separated into pairs, Ray with Mike, Greg with Tom, and headed to different hunting areas. Greg's partnership with Tom, a methodical hunter with extensive backcountry experience, felt comfortable and reassuring. They established themselves in a ground blind, overlooking a natural funnel where deer trails converged, settled in, and began the patient work of waiting. The day proved successful beyond expectations. By mid-afternoon, each pair had harvested a deer, a 6-point buck for Greg and Tom, an impressive 8-pointer for Ray and Mike. They converged back at camp with their respective trophies, and the real work began. Following their new protocols, they transported the deer to the designated processing area, a clearing about 100 yards from the main cabin. They worked efficiently, field dressing the animals and hanging them from a sturdy tripod constructed specifically for this purpose. Greg found himself frequently scanning the forest edge, but the vigilance felt appropriate rather than paranoid, a natural adaptation to hunting in bear country. As they finished securing the carcasses, Ray handed Greg a small canister. "Almost forgot. Brought this for you." Greg examined the object. A new can of bear spray in a holster designed to attach to a belt or pack strap. "Thanks," he said, genuinely appreciative of the thoughtfulness. "Figure it can't hurt to have multiple deterrent options," Ray said with a shrug. "Tom and Mike have theirs too." The remainder of the hunting trip passed without incident. They processed the deer according to their new protocols, storing meat in the bear-proof container until it could be transported home. They maintained heightened awareness but encountered no bears. The woods provided its usual restorative effects: the silence, the connection to natural rhythms, the satisfaction of successful hunts. On their final evening, as they packed most of their gear in preparation for an early departure the next morning, Greg found himself drawn to the edge of the clearing. The waning moon provided just enough light to make out the silhouettes of the surrounding trees and the darker mass of the forest beyond. Somewhere out there, bears were preparing for winter, their bodies slowing, their behaviors changing with the season. Next spring would bring new cubs, continuing the cycle that had persisted long before humans established hunting cabins in these woods. Ray joined him after a few minutes. "Saying goodbye to the place?" "For now," Greg confirmed. "We'll be back next year." "That's the plan." Ray was quiet for a moment, then added, "You know, I was thinking maybe we should offer a sort of workshop for the other cabin owners in the area. Share what we've learned about bear safety, proper food storage, that kind of thing. Might prevent someone else from going through what you did." The suggestion resonated with Greg's ongoing efforts to derive meaning from his experience. "I like that idea. Could coordinate with the DNR, maybe Dr. Thornton's team, make it comprehensive." They stood in companionable silence for a few more minutes before returning to the cabin, where Tom and Mike were engaged in their traditional last-night card game. Greg joined them, falling easily into the familiar pattern of friendly competition and good-natured ribbing. In the morning, they completed their packing, secured the cabin, and prepared to depart. As Greg did his final walkthrough, ensuring nothing essential had been forgotten, he paused in the main room. The space felt different now, not defined by trauma, as he had feared it might be, but reclaimed as a place of positive significance. The drive home, Greg found himself reflecting on the entire arc of the experience, from the attack itself through recovery, education efforts, and finally, this return. The bear had changed him, certainly. He carried the physical scars and a new awareness of vulnerability that would never entirely disappear. Yet he had also gained something valuable, a deeper understanding of his place in the natural world, a more nuanced respect for wild creatures, a platform from which to share important safety information with others. At a rest stop near Gaylord, where the four men stopped for fuel and coffee, Tom voiced what Greg had been contemplating. "So, successful trip all around, I'd say. Good hunting, no bear encounters, great weather." "And Greg facing his demons," Mike added. "That's worth celebrating too." Greg shook his head slightly. "Not demons, just consequences, results of choices made, lessons learned." Ray clapped him on the shoulder. "Philosophical, as always, but they're right about one thing. It's good to have you back in the woods with us." As they continued south toward home, the landscape gradually transitioning from the remote forests of the UP to the more developed areas of the lower peninsula. Greg felt a sense of completion. The bear story, his bear story, had not ended with the attack or even with his recovery. It continued to unfold through every presentation he gave, every safety protocol he helped develop, every return to the wilderness that had momentarily become hostile but remained fundamentally welcoming. The bear itself was gone, killed partly by Greg's desperate defense and partly by Ray's protective response. Yet its legacy persisted, in Greg's scars, in his changed approach to wilderness, in the knowledge he now shared with others. In that sense, the encounter had created a connection rather than severed one, binding Greg more consciously to the wild places he had always loved and to the creatures, both benign and dangerous, that inhabited them. When he finally arrived home, Diane met him at the door, her expression a mixture of relief and curiosity. "How was it?" she asked simply. Greg considered the question, wanting to give her a true answer rather than a simple reassurance. "It was healing," he said finally. "Being there again, doing the things we've always done, but with new awareness. It felt right." Her smile told him she understood. As he brought his gear into the house, moving somewhat stiffly after the long drive, but with purpose and satisfaction, Greg knew that the bear story had found its proper place in his life, not as a defining trauma, but as one significant chapter in a continuing narrative, a reminder of both human vulnerability and resilience in wild places where humans are guests rather than masters. The scars on his chest and arm would fade further with time, but never disappear entirely. Similarly, the memory of those terrifying moments beneath the bear's weight would remain within him, influencing his actions and perspectives in ways both obvious and subtle. Yet these remnants of the encounter represented not limitation but integration, the incorporation of an extreme experience into a life that continued to embrace the natural world in all its complexity, beauty, and occasional danger. In the weeks that followed, Greg completed his collaboration with Dr. Thornton, finalized plans for the cabin owner's workshop Ray had suggested, and returned to his regular routines with a renewed appreciation for their ordinary comforts. The bear walked with him always now, not as a threat but as a teacher, a reminder of wild truths that modern humans often forget but can never entirely escape. And in that walking alongside, Greg found not fear, but a deeper connection to the ancient realities that underpin even the most civilized of human lives. Michelle Rodriguez pulled her United States Postal Service truck onto the narrow gravel road that would take her deep into the Adirondack wilderness. The late September morning was crisp, the kind that promised warmth by noon, but delivered a chill that seeped through her lightweight uniform jacket. At 34, Michelle had been delivering mail along this rural route for nearly 7 years, and she'd grown to love the solitude and natural beauty that came with the job. The Postal Service Grumman LLV wasn't the most comfortable vehicle, drafty in winter, sweltering in summer, but it was reliable enough to navigate the increasingly remote terrain of her route. This particular section, which she serviced every Tuesday and Friday, consisted of scattered cabins and year-round residences tucked away in the densely forested mountains. Some were vacation homes occupied only during summer months, while others housed locals who preferred isolation to the relative bustle of nearby towns like Saranac Lake or Lake Placid. It made for an interesting mix of mailboxes, sometimes overflowing, with weeks' worth of correspondence, others carefully maintained and emptied daily. Michelle checked her watch. She was making good time despite the extra packages that seemed to multiply with each passing year as more people shopped online. Even in these remote areas, people expected their Amazon deliveries and subscription boxes. The Postal Service had added more package-focused routes over the years, but Michelle's route remained mixed. Letters, bills, magazines, and the occasional box that would fit in her truck. The really large stuff went to the UPS guys who, Michelle sometimes thought, probably earned more than she did for dealing with the same treacherous roads. She hummed along to the radio, a classic rock station that faded in and out as she drove, deeper into the mountains. Reception was spotty out here, one of the many reminders that she was leaving civilization behind. Michelle didn't mind. After a hectic morning at the Saranac Lake post office, sorting mail and loading her truck, the peaceful drive was a welcome change of pace. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder where she kept it. Michelle glanced at it briefly, a text from her sister Elena back in Syracuse, probably about their mother's upcoming 70th birthday. Michelle would check it later when she took her lunch break at the small state park picnic area that marked roughly the halfway point of her route. She had long ago learned to manage her time efficiently on these delivery days, knowing exactly where to stop, which mailboxes could be reached from her truck window, and which required her to hop out and walk a package to a front porch. The road narrowed further as it wound upward, tall pines and maples crowding close to the shoulders. Their leaves were just beginning to turn, hints of gold and crimson emerging among the green. In another 2 weeks, these mountains would be ablaze with fall colors, attracting tourists and photographers who sometimes clogged even these remote roads. Michelle preferred the quieter seasons, though she couldn't deny the beauty of an Adirondack autumn. Her first delivery was to the Johnsons' cabin, a modest A-frame set back from the road. Michelle pulled up to their mailbox, stuffed a handful of envelopes inside, and continued on. The next several stops were similarly routine. Mail deposited, small packages left in boxes or on porches. The rhythm of her workday as familiar as breathing. At the Henderson place, an older couple who lived here year-round, Michelle had a medium-sized package that required a signature. She parked the truck, grabbed the package and her electronic scanner, and made her way up the winding path to their front door. Martha Henderson answered on the second knock, her face lighting up with a smile. "Michelle, dear. Perfect timing. I just put on a pot of coffee." This was their routine. Every few weeks, when Michelle delivered something requiring a signature, Martha would invite her in for coffee. And every few weeks, Michelle would politely decline while accepting a to-go cup and whatever baked goods Martha insisted on pressing into her hands. "Can't today, Mrs. Henderson. I'm running a tight schedule," Michelle said with a smile. "But I wouldn't say no to a cup for the road." Martha nodded knowingly. "Of course, dear. Let me get you fixed up while you tell me about your week." 5 minutes later, Michelle was back in her truck with a travel mug of excellent coffee and a paper bag containing what smelled like freshly baked banana bread. These small kindnesses were part of what made her job worthwhile. In a world increasingly dominated by digital communication, these human connections remained important, perhaps even more so, along a route where people might go days without seeing another person. She continued along her route, the morning passing in the pleasant routine of deliveries. At 11:15, Michelle reached the small state park picnic area that served as her regular lunch spot. She parked the postal vehicle in the gravel lot, which was empty today. Tourist season was winding down, and locals tended to avoid these areas until the leaf peepers had come and gone. Michelle grabbed her lunch cooler from behind her seat, a turkey sandwich, apple, and the Henderson banana bread, and walked to her favorite table beneath a large maple tree. The day had warmed as expected, though a persistent breeze kept it comfortable. She took her time eating, scrolling through her phone messages, responding to her sister about their mother's birthday plans, a small family dinner, nothing extravagant as their mother had requested, and enjoying the brief respite from driving. Just as she was packing up her cooler, Michelle noticed movement at the edge of the picnic area, where the manicured lawn gave way to forest. A flash of russet brown disappeared into the underbrush. Probably a deer, she thought, though she hadn't gotten a good look. Wildlife sightings were common enough that she didn't give it much thought as she returned to her truck and continued her route. The afternoon portion of her deliveries took her even deeper into the mountains, along roads that grew increasingly rough. Michelle slowed the postal vehicle, navigating around potholes and washboard sections with the skill born of years of experience. Her next cluster of deliveries included several cabins along Loon Lake, a small pristine body of water popular with kayakers and fishermen. The Collins family, who owned one of the larger properties on the lake, had been receiving heavy packages lately, building supplies from the look of them. Michelle had heard they were adding a boathouse, taking advantage of the off-season to complete the work before winter set in. Today's delivery was another large box labeled marine-grade hardware. She pulled into their long driveway, noting that Tom Collins' truck wasn't there. He was probably in town getting more supplies. Michelle lugged the heavy package to the covered porch, leaving it in the designated spot where it would stay dry if the weather turned. She was halfway back to her truck when she heard a rustling sound from the side of the property where dense woods encroached on the manicured lawn. She paused, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, an instinctive reaction she couldn't explain. Quickening her pace, Michelle returned to her vehicle, started it up, and continued down the road. She wasn't particularly nervous about wildlife encounters. They were part of the job in this area. Still, certain animal encounters warranted caution. Bears especially were always a consideration in the Adirondacks, though she'd only spotted them from a distance a handful of times in her years on this route. The next section of her journey took her along one of the most isolated stretches of road on her route, a 5-mile connector between two more developed areas. Few homes dotted this stretch, just the occasional hunting cabin or off-grid dwelling. The forest pressed close on both sides, the canopy sometimes meeting overhead to create a tunnel of greenery. Michelle always drove this section with heightened awareness, knowing that help would be far away if her truck broke down or she encountered any other problems. She was about halfway through this section when she rounded a bend and immediately applied her brakes. Standing in the middle of the narrow road, approximately 50 yards ahead, was a black bear. It wasn't huge as bears go, likely a young adult male from its size, but substantial enough to command respect. Michelle estimated it weighed around 200 pounds. She remained perfectly still in her vehicle, engine idling. The proper protocol was clear. Stay in your vehicle, don't honk or make loud noises unless the bear approaches aggressively, and wait for it to move on. Bears were generally shy creatures that avoided human contact when possible. This particular bear, however, showed no immediate inclination to leave the road. It stood on all fours, head lowered slightly, appearing to sniff the asphalt. Perhaps someone had thrown food from a car window, Michelle thought, or maybe it was simply using the road as an easier path through the dense forest. After several minutes of waiting, with the bear showing no signs of moving, Michelle considered her options. She could continue waiting. Bears typically didn't linger long in exposed areas, but she was now running behind schedule. She had another 3 hours of deliveries ahead of her, and daylight was a precious commodity, especially on these remote roads where streetlights didn't exist. Carefully, she pressed the horn once, a quick tap that produced a short, sharp sound. The bear's head jerked up, looking directly at her vehicle. It didn't run, but took a step backward, clearly startled by the noise. Encouraged, Michelle tapped the horn again, slightly longer this time. The bear shuffled to the side of the road, but didn't retreat into the forest. It seemed uncertain, perhaps confused by this strange object making unfamiliar noises. Michelle decided to try inching the vehicle forward, hoping the bear would recognize it as something to avoid. She put the postal truck in gear and moved forward at a walking pace, ready to stop immediately if the bear showed any signs of aggression. The animal watched her approach, its posture shifting subtly in a way that made Michelle uneasy. She'd encountered enough wildlife to recognize tension in an animal's body language. At about 30 yards distance, Michelle stopped again. The bear had moved partly off the road, but remained too close for comfort. It stood at the edge of the pavement, front paws on the gravel shoulder, back paws on the asphalt. Its head was raised now, nose lifted as if catching her scent on the breeze. Michelle tapped the horn again a bit more insistently. This time the bear's reaction was different. Instead of backing away, it rose briefly onto its hind legs, a posture that allowed it to better see, smell and assess potential threats. Standing upright, even a medium-sized black bear was an imposing sight, easily reaching 5 feet in height. After a moment, the bear dropped back to all fours. Michelle expected it to retreat into the woods, but instead, it took a deliberate step back onto the road directly in her path. Something about its demeanor had changed. The uncertain, startled animal was gone, replaced by something more purposeful. Michelle felt the first real flicker of concern. She'd had her share of bear encounters over the years, but always from a safer distance, and the animals had invariably retreated when they became aware of human presence. This bear's behavior didn't follow the usual pattern. Perhaps it was sick or injured, she thought. Or maybe it had become habituated to humans through improper food storage or deliberate feeding, a dangerous situation that occasionally developed in areas where tourists and wildlife intersected. Whatever the reason, Michelle decided that waiting was her safest option. Eventually, the bear would move on, or another vehicle might come along and help scare it away. She turned off her engine to conserve fuel and reached for her phone. No service, as expected in this section of her route. Michelle settled into wait, keeping her eyes on the bear, which had begun pacing back and forth across the narrow road. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The bear continued its pacing, occasionally stopping to sniff the air or look in her direction. It showed no signs of losing interest or moving on. Michelle checked her watch, calculating the delay against her remaining deliveries. If this continued much longer, she'd be finishing her route in twilight, something she preferred to avoid on these isolated mountain roads. After 20 minutes, Michelle decided she needed to try a different approach. The bear had moved slightly to one side of the road during its pacing. If she accelerated quickly enough, there might be room to navigate around it before it could react. Black bears were fast but rarely aggressive unless provoked or cornered. If she could get past it without stopping, She should be safe. She started the engine again, the sound causing the bear to look up sharply. Michelle didn't hesitate. She pressed the accelerator, the postal truck lurching forward with as much speed as its modest engine could generate. The bear, startled by the sudden movement, took a few steps back but remained on the roadside. As Michelle neared the animal, she veered to the opposite side of the road, giving it as wide a berth as the narrow pavement allowed. For a moment, it seemed her plan would work. The bear watched as she approached, but didn't immediately move to intercept her. Then, when she was almost parallel with the animal, perhaps 15 feet away, the bear suddenly charged toward the vehicle. Michelle gasped, instinctively jerking the steering wheel further away, which sent the right side tires off the pavement and onto the soft shoulder. The postal truck tilted alarmingly, forcing her to correct back toward the center of the road and closer to the charging bear. The animal reached the truck just as Michelle was attempting to accelerate past it. With surprising strength, it reared up and slammed its front paws against the driver's side of the vehicle. The impact rocked the truck sideways, nearly causing Michelle to lose control on the narrow road. Heart pounding, she managed to keep the vehicle moving forward, gaining a small lead on the bear. In her rearview mirror, she saw it drop to all fours and charge after her. Black bears could reach speeds of 30 miles per hour in short bursts, faster than her fully loaded postal truck could manage on this rough road. Michelle pushed the accelerator to the floor, the engine whining in protest as the vehicle bounced over the uneven surface. The bear pursued for about 50 yards, then gradually fell behind as it reached the limits of its sprinting ability. Eventually, it stopped in the middle of the road, watching as she pulled away. Shaking with adrenaline, Michelle continued driving until she could no longer see the bear in her mirrors. Only then did she pull over, putting the truck in park and taking several deep breaths to steady herself. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. In all her years delivering mail in bear country, she'd never experienced anything like this. The key encounter had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. Black bears were generally not aggressive toward humans, unless protecting cubs or food sources. This one had seemed unusually bold, almost confrontational. Michelle checked the time. The delay had cost her nearly half an hour. She needed to keep moving if she wanted to complete her route before dark, but the thought of driving back along this same road later made her uneasy. After a few moments to collect herself, Michelle put the truck in gear and continued her deliveries. The next hour passed uneventfully. As she worked her way through several more remote cabins, she found herself scanning the forest edges more frequently than usual, the bear encounter still fresh in her mind. At the Petersons' cabin, one of the last before she would need to return along that same isolated stretch of road, Michelle mentioned the bear to Tom Peterson as she delivered a package. A black bear? In the middle of the road? Tom frowned. That's unusual this time of year. They're usually busy fattening up for winter, not hanging around roads. This one seemed almost interested in my truck, Michelle said. Followed me for a bit when I drove around it. Tom's frown deepened. That's not good. Sounds like it might be habituated to people. Someone's probably been feeding it intentionally or not. I'm a bit concerned about driving back that way, Michelle admitted. Want me to follow you for that stretch? Tom offered. I was heading into town anyway for some supplies. Michelle was tempted but shook her head. Thanks, but I should be fine. It's probably long gone by now. Well, take this just in case. Tom disappeared into a shed and returned with a can of bear spray. Use it if you have to. But remember, it's only effective at close range, 20 feet or less, and you need to be upwind. Michelle accepted the spray with thanks, though she hoped she wouldn't need to use it. She'd had bear safety training as part of her job, but the Postal Service vehicles weren't equipped with deterrents. The official policy was simply to avoid encounters and wait for animals to move on. With her deliveries completed, Michelle began the return journey. The afternoon was waning, long shadows stretching across the road as the sun lowered behind the mountains. She drove cautiously, especially as she approached the section where she'd encountered the bear. To her relief, the road was clear. She passed the spot where the bear had stood without incident and began to relax slightly. Perhaps it had simply been a random encounter after all, nothing to worry about for future deliveries. Then, rounding a bend about a mile from the original sighting, Michelle slammed on her brakes. The bear was back, or perhaps it had never left this general area. It stood at the edge of the road, partially concealed by underbrush, but unmistakable in its size and shape. This time it wasn't alone. A second, smaller bear, possibly a yearling cub, was visible behind it. Michelle immediately understood the situation with newfound clarity. This wasn't a random aggressive bear, it was a mother protecting her cub. Black bear mothers were notoriously protective, and while the cub was not tiny, probably born the previous year and nearly grown, the maternal instinct remained strong. She stopped the postal truck a good 50 yards away, weighing her options. Going back wasn't practical. It would add hours to her return journey on roads that became treacherous after dark. Waiting again might mean getting caught in these mountains after sunset, something her supervisor had explicitly warned against. The bear spray offered some protection, but she'd need to be outside the vehicle to use it, a last resort at best. As Michelle considered what to do, the decision was suddenly made for her. Without warning, the mother bear charged toward the postal truck, moving with surprising speed for an animal its size. The cub remained at the roadside, watching. Michelle immediately put the truck in gear and accelerated. Her plan was the same as before, to build up speed and pass the charging bear before it reached her. But the animal was closer this time and moving fast. As Michelle attempted to swerve around it, the bear reached the side of the vehicle. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The bear reared up alongside the truck, paws slamming against the driver's side door with tremendous force. Michelle heard the screech of claws on metal as the animal tried to maintain contact with the moving vehicle. Then, in a moment that would replay in her nightmares for months to come, the bear's paw smashed through the side window. Glass shattered inward, spraying across Michelle's face and upper body. She screamed, instinctively raising one arm to protect her eyes while trying to maintain control of the vehicle with the other. The truck swerved dangerously, nearly leaving the road entirely before Michelle managed to straighten it. The bear's paw withdrew from the window as the vehicle picked up speed, but not before its claws caught Michelle's sleeve, tearing the fabric and grazing her arm. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, but adrenaline kept her focused on escape. She floored the accelerator, the postal truck bouncing violently over the rough road as she put distance between herself and the bear. In her mirrors, she could see the animal drop to all fours and begin pursuit, but as before, it couldn't maintain the speed for long. After 100 yards or so, it stopped, watching as she drove away. Only when the bear was no longer visible did Michelle allow herself to assess the damage. Blood trickled from several cuts on her face and neck where flying glass had struck her. Her left arm throbbed where the bear's claws had grazed it, the uniform sleeve torn and spotted with blood. The driver's side window was completely gone, allowing the cool mountain air to whip through the cabin. Michelle's hands shook violently on the steering wheel, shock beginning to set in as the immediate danger passed. She needed to stop, to treat her injuries, but not here, not with the bear potentially still nearby. She forced herself to keep driving, ignoring the pain and the glass fragments that covered the seat and floor. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, Michelle reached a small pull-off area with a scenic overlook. She stopped the truck, put it in park, and finally allowed herself to acknowledge what had just happened. Tears welled up, a delayed reaction to the terror of the encounter. She gave herself exactly 1 minute to cry, then took a deep breath and shifted into problem-solving mode. First, the injuries. Michelle kept a first aid kit in the truck, standard postal service equipment. She retrieved it from under the passenger seat, brushing away glass fragments, and assessed the damage in the rearview mirror. Several small cuts marked her cheek and neck, none especially deep, but all bleeding freely as facial wounds tend to do. The injury to her arm was more concerning. 3 parallel scratches about 4 inches long, deeper than the facial cuts, but not deep enough to require immediate stitches. Michelle cleaned the wounds as best she could with the antiseptic wipes from the kit, wincing at the sting. She applied pressure to stop the bleeding, then covered the larger cuts with adhesive bandages. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do until she could get proper medical attention. Next, the truck. The missing window was a serious problem. September evenings in the Adirondacks grew cold quickly, and she still had at least an hour's drive back to the post office. More importantly, the damage would need to be reported and explained, something Michelle wasn't looking forward to. She did what she could to remove the largest glass fragments from the seat and floor, then used packing tape from her supplies to secure a large plastic bag over the window opening. It was a makeshift solution that wouldn't keep out all the cold air, but it was better than nothing. Finally, Michelle reached for her phone. She had a signal here, weak but present. She dialed her supervisor's number, dreading the conversation to come. Saranac Lake Post Office, Mark speaking. Mark, it's Michelle. I've had an incident on my route. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, tight with lingering fear and pain. What kind of incident? Mark's tone shifted immediately to concern. A bear attacked my truck. Broke the driver's side window. I'm okay, just some cuts from the glass, but the vehicle is damaged. A bear? The disbelief was evident in Mark's voice. Where are you now? Are you safe? I'm at the Mountain Vista Overlook, about 40 minutes from the office. The bear is well behind me now. I'm safe, but the truck..." She trailed off, suddenly, overwhelmed by the reality of what had happened. "Forget the truck," Mark said firmly. "Are you sure you don't need medical attention? I can call for emergency services." Michelle considered her injuries. The bleeding had mostly stopped, and, while she'd definitely need a tetanus shot and possibly antibiotics for the claw marks, nothing seemed immediately life-threatening. "I think I can make it back," she said, "but I'll need to file an incident report, and the truck will need repairs. Don't worry about any of that right now. Just get yourself back here safely, and we'll sort everything else out. Drive carefully, Michelle." After ending the call, Michelle sat for a few more minutes, gathering her composure. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving her shaky and exhausted, but she couldn't stay here. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon, and she needed to get off these mountain roads before darkness fell. With a deep breath, Michelle put the truck in gear and continued her journey back to Saranac Lake. The makeshift window covering flapped noisily in the wind, and cold air filled the cab, but she barely noticed. Her mind replayed the attack in vivid detail: the bear's surprising speed, the sound of shattering glass, the terrifying moment when the animal's paw had entered her space. By the time Michelle reached the post office, the parking lot was nearly empty. Mark was waiting for her, his expression changing from worry to shock as she stepped out of the damaged vehicle. "Jesus, Michelle," he said, taking in her bandaged face and torn blood-stained sleeve. "You need to go to the hospital." "I need to file the report first," she insisted, "and secure the truck." "The report can wait. I'm driving you to the emergency room right now." Too exhausted to argue, Michelle allowed her supervisor to lead her to his car. The adrenaline had completely worn off now, leaving her injuries throbbing painfully. The cuts on her face stung in the cool evening air, and her arm felt as though it were on fire. The Adirondack Medical Center was only a 10-minute drive from the post office. Mark ushered Michelle into the emergency room, explaining the situation to the triage nurse, who immediately took her to an examination room. What followed was a blur of activity: doctors examining her wounds, a painful cleaning and debridement of the claw marks, a tetanus shot, prescriptions for antibiotics and pain medication. X-rays were taken to ensure no glass fragments remained embedded in her skin. A plastic surgeon was consulted about the facial lacerations, but fortunately, none were deep enough to require stitches that would leave significant scarring. Through it all, Michelle answered the same questions repeatedly. Yes, it was a black bear. No, she hadn't approached it or left her vehicle. Yes, she'd followed protocol by waiting for it to leave. No, she'd never experienced anything like this before in her years on the route. By the time she was released, nearly 3 hours had passed. Mark was waiting in the lobby, having contacted Michelle's emergency contact, her sister Elena, who was driving up from Syracuse to stay with her for the night. "The postal inspector wants to talk to you tomorrow," Mark said as he drove her home. "And the State Department of Environmental Conservation will probably want a statement too. Bears attacking vehicles isn't common." Michelle nodded, too drained to speak much. The pain medication was beginning to take effect, dulling the sharp edges of her discomfort, but making her thoughts fuzzy. "You don't need to worry about your route tomorrow," Mark continued. "We'll get someone to cover it. Take a few days if you need to." "Thank you," Michelle managed. The thought of returning to that isolated road, of potentially encountering the bear again, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. At her small apartment on the outskirts of Saranac Lake, Mark helped her inside and made sure she had everything she needed until her sister arrived. Michelle thanked him again, then locked the door behind him and made her way to the bathroom. The face that stared back at her from the mirror was almost unrecognizable. Several bandages dotted her left cheek and neck, covering the worst of the cuts. A large bruise was developing along her jawline, where she'd been struck by a particularly large piece of glass. Her left arm was wrapped in gauze from elbow to wrist, covering the claw marks that the doctor had assured her were superficial but would likely leave scars. Michelle showered carefully, avoiding getting her bandages wet as instructed, then changed into comfortable clothes and settled on her couch to wait for Elena. Her phone buzzed with messages from concerned co-workers who'd already heard about the incident. News traveled fast in small post offices. Elena arrived just after 10, letting herself in with the spare key she'd always had. One look at Michelle's bandaged face, and her sister's composure crumbled. "Oh my God, Mish," she said, dropping her overnight bag and rushing to embrace her. "When Mark called, I thought maybe it was just a little fender bender or something. He didn't say how bad it was." "It looks worse than it feels," Michelle lied, returning the hug with her uninjured arm. "The pain meds are pretty good." Elena stepped back, studying her with the critical eye of an older sister. "What exactly happened?" "Mark just said something about a bear attack." Michelle recounted the story, the details still vivid despite her medication-induced haziness. Elena listened in growing horror, especially when Michelle described the bear's paw coming through the window. "You could have been killed," Elena said when she'd finished, "if those claws had caught your face instead of your arm." "But they didn't," Michelle said firmly, unwilling to dwell on what-ifs. "I'm okay, just a little banged up." "You're not delivering mail out there anymore," Elena declared. "It's too dangerous." Michelle sighed. They'd had similar conversations before, usually after news reports of severe weather or accidents on mountain roads. Elena had never approved of her remote route, preferring Michelle take a safer position in the city. "Let's not have this conversation tonight," Michelle said. "I'm too tired to argue." Elena relented, shifting into caretaking mode. She made tea, checked Michelle's bandages, and ensured she took her antibiotics as prescribed. By 11, Michelle was in bed, exhaustion finally overcoming the lingering adrenaline and anxiety. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and filled with dreams of pursuing bears and shattering glass. Michelle woke several times, disoriented and in pain as the medication wore off. Each time she'd take another dose as permitted, drift back to sleep and repeat the cycle. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through her bedroom curtains and the smell of coffee wafting from the kitchen. Michelle sat up gingerly, assessing her condition. The cuts on her face throbbed dully, and her arm felt stiff and painful beneath the bandages. But she was alive, and considering what had happened, that felt like enough of a victory. Elena had already been busy, Michelle discovered as she made her way to the kitchen. Her sister sat at the small table, laptop open, a notepad filled with her neat handwriting beside it. "I've been researching bear attacks in the Adirondacks," Elena announced without preamble. "They're rare, especially involving black bears. There's a procedure for reporting problem bears to the DEC. I've got the number." Michelle accepted the mug of coffee Elena offered. "Mark said they'd probably contact me." "You should contact them first," Elena insisted. "That bear is dangerous. It needs to be relocated before it attacks someone else." Michelle nodded too, tired to point out that the logistics of tracking and relocating a specific bear in thousands of acres of wilderness were complicated at best, impossible at worst. She sipped her coffee, wincing as the hot liquid touched a small cut on her lip she hadn't even noticed before. Her phone rang. Mark from the post office, checking on her condition and informing her that the postal inspector would be coming by her apartment around noon to take her statement. The truck had been taken to a repair shop in Lake Placid, the only one in the area equipped to handle commercial vehicles. "The damage is pretty extensive," Mark told her. "Not just the window, but deep scratches all along the side panel. The inspector will need photos of your injuries too for the report." After breakfast, Michelle showered and changed her bandages as instructed by the hospital. The cuts on her face looked angry and red in the morning light, but the bleeding had stopped. The claw marks on her arm were another matter. The gauze had stuck to the wounds and removing it reopened them slightly, causing fresh bleeding that Michelle struggled to stop with Elena's help. "You should go back to the hospital," Elena fretted. "These might need stitches after all." "The doctor said this might happen," Michelle assured her. "It'll stop bleeding soon. We just need to apply pressure." Eventually, they managed to get the wounds clean and rebandaged. Michelle dressed carefully in loose clothing that wouldn't irritate her injuries. By the time the postal inspector arrived, she was feeling somewhat more human, though still shaken by the previous day's events. Inspector Reynolds was a middle-aged man with the brisk, no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen it all in his career with the Postal Service. He took photographs of Michelle's injuries, recorded her statement about the incident, and had her sign several forms confirming the details. "In 23 years with the Postal Service, I've never had a bear attack case," he admitted as he packed up his materials. "Dog attacks, yes, dozens, crashes due to weather, absolutely, but never a bear through a window. Lucky me," Michelle said dryly. "The vehicle damage is consistent with your account," Reynolds continued, ignoring her sarcasm. "And your injuries clearly indicate you were in the vehicle when the window broke. I've already spoken with your supervisor about safety protocols for that route going forward." "What kind of protocols?" Michelle asked, suddenly concerned. While she wasn't eager to return to the scene of the attack, this was still her route, one she'd built relationships on over years of service. "To be determined," Reynolds said vaguely. "The DEC will need to assess the situation first. Speaking of which, They're sending someone over this afternoon. I gave them your contact information. After the inspector left, Michelle fielded more calls and messages from concerned friends and colleagues. Word had spread quickly, and by lunchtime, her neighbor Mrs. Watkins had brought over a homemade casserole for the recovery, as though Michelle had undergone major surgery rather than suffered a few cuts. Elena hovered anxiously, suggesting Michelle take a nap before the DEC officer arrived. Michelle declined. Despite her physical discomfort, she felt mentally alert, perhaps due to the residual effects of yesterday's adrenaline surge. Instead, she sat on her small balcony, gazing out at the distant mountains where the attack had occurred, trying to process her feelings about the incident. The DEC officer arrived promptly at 3, a compact, capable-looking woman who introduced herself as Ranger Santos. Unlike Inspector Reynolds, she seemed genuinely interested in the details of Michelle's encounter, asking specific questions about the bear's behavior, size, and distinguishing features. "It sounds like you encountered a mother with a yearling cub," Santos confirmed after hearing the full account. "That explains the aggressive behavior. Black bears are rarely confrontational unless they perceive a threat to their young. Will you try to relocate them?" Elena asked from her position on the couch, where she'd been listening intently. Ranger Santos's expression was diplomatic, but realistic. "We'll certainly investigate the area and post warnings for visitors. If we can identify the specific bear and it shows a pattern of aggression or habituation to humans, relocation might be considered. But it's important to understand that this bear was displaying natural protective behavior in its own habitat. It attacked a postal vehicle," Elena pointed out. "That's not natural behavior. Bears don't understand the concept of vehicles," Santos explained patiently. "They perceive them as potential threats, especially when they make unusual noises, like honking. The postal truck was between a mother and her cub. From the bear's perspective, that's a threatening situation." Michelle understood the ranger's point, even if her sister didn't. "So what happens now?" "We'll increase patrols in that area and post bear warning signs. I'll file my report, which will go into our database of bear encounters. If there are other incidents in the same area, it will help establish a pattern." Santos handed Michelle a card. "If you think of any other details or have questions, you can reach me directly at this number." After the ranger left, Elena was visibly dissatisfied. "That's it? They're just going to put up some signs? You could have been killed. What do you expect them to do, Elena? Hunt down every bear in the Adirondacks?" Michelle was tired. Her injuries were throbbing, and her sister's protective indignation, while well-intentioned, was becoming exhausting. "Not every bear, just the one that attacked you." Elena began pacing the small living room. "I'm going to call the local newspaper. The public should know about dangerous bears in the area." "Please don't," Michelle said firmly. "I don't want this becoming some big story. I'm fine. The bear was protecting its cub, and turning this into a media circus won't help anyone." Reluctantly, Elena agreed to let the matter drop, though Michelle suspected her sister might still make some calls once she returned to Syracuse. For now, though, she was grateful for the support, especially as the pain in her arm intensified throughout the evening. That night, Michelle slept better, exhaustion finally overcoming the discomfort of her injuries. In the morning, Elena had to return to Syracuse for work, leaving Michelle with strict instructions to rest, take her medication, and call immediately if anything changed with her wounds. Alone in her apartment, Michelle found herself restless. Mark had arranged for her route to be covered for the remainder of the week, leaving her with unexpected free time. She wasn't used to idleness, and despite the pain and fatigue, she felt a growing need to return to normal activities. By mid-morning, she decided to drive to the post office, just to check in and perhaps help with some sorting tasks she could manage despite her injured arm. The post office was busy when she arrived, the morning rush of customers collecting packages and buying stamps in full swing. Her appearance caused an immediate stir. Colleagues who had only heard about the incident reacted with shock at the visible evidence of her encounter. Even customers, many of whom Michelle knew from years of delivering their mail, expressed concern and curiosity. "Is it true you fought off a grizzly bear?" asked Mr. Delaney, a regular who mailed packages to his grandchildren every Monday. "It was a black bear, not a grizzly," Michelle corrected gently. "And I didn't fight it off. I just drove away." "Still, what an ordeal. It'll make quite a story to tell your grandkids someday." Michelle smiled politely, though the thought of recounting the terrifying experience as an entertaining anecdote for future generations didn't appeal to her at the moment. Mark emerged from his office, surprised to see her. "Michelle, what are..." "You doing here? You're supposed to be resting." "I was going stir-crazy at home," she admitted. "I thought maybe I could help with sorting or something." Mark looked skeptical, but ultimately allowed her to assist with some light tasks in the back room, away from the curious stares of customers. As she worked, Michelle learned that her story had indeed spread beyond the post office. The local weekly newspaper had included a brief mention in their police blotter section: "Postal carrier injured in wildlife encounter on remote road." The vague description had apparently sparked rumors and speculation throughout the small community. "Someone at the diner was saying you were mauled by a mountain lion," reported Jen, a fellow carrier, during their break. "I told them it was a bear, but they insisted their cousin's friend who works at the hospital said mountain lion." Michelle shook her head, marveling at how quickly information became distorted. "Definitely a bear. I saw it clearly." "Are you coming back to your route?" Jen asked, the question Michelle had been asking herself since the incident. "Of course," she said with more confidence than she felt. "As soon as the doctor clears me." The thought of returning to that isolated stretch of road, of potentially encountering the bear again, sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest. But this was her job, her routine, her responsibility to the people who depended on their mail delivery. In the afternoon, Michelle received an unexpected visitor at the post office. Tom Peterson, the resident who had given her the bear spray, had come to town for supplies as planned and stopped by to check on her. "I heard what happened after you left my place," he said, genuinely concerned. "I should have insisted on following you back through that section." "It wouldn't have made any difference," Michelle assured him. "The bear was protecting her cub. Even with 2 vehicles, she might have charged. Still, I feel responsible." "If you'd used the spray—" "I didn't have a chance," Michelle explained. "Everything happened too fast, and I was inside the truck anyway. Bear spray is for outside encounters." Tom nodded, accepting her explanation. "Well, for what it's worth, I've lived in these mountains for 20 years, and I've never heard of a black bear breaking a vehicle window. It's extremely unusual behavior." His words were meant to be reassuring, suggesting this was a rare, unlikely to be repeated occurrence, but Michelle found them unsettling. If even long-time residents considered the attack unusual, perhaps there was something particularly aggressive about this specific bear. Throughout the day, Michelle found herself reliving moments of the encounter, especially in quiet moments between tasks. The sound of shattering glass, the sudden pain, the bear's paw inside her space, these sensory memories would intrude without warning, causing her heart rate to spike and her hands to tremble slightly. By late afternoon, she was exhausted, the combination of physical pain and emotional strain taking its toll. Mark insisted she go home early, and Michelle didn't argue. As she drove back to her apartment, she took a different route than usual, one that passed by the lake rather than skirting the forest edge. It was longer but felt safer somehow. The next few days fell into a pattern. Michelle would spend mornings at home changing bandages and resting, then go to the post office for a few hours to help with manageable tasks. Her facial cuts began to heal, the smaller ones fading to pink lines, the larger ones forming scabs that itched constantly. The claw marks on her arm remained tender and red, requiring regular cleaning and antibiotic ointment to prevent infection. On Friday, 4 days after the attack, Michelle returned to the hospital for a follow-up appointment. The doctor pronounced her facial lacerations to be healing well with minimal scarring expected. The claw marks were another matter. They were deeper than initially assessed, and one showed signs of mild infection despite the antibiotics. The doctor prescribed a stronger antibiotic and suggested Michelle might not be ready to return to full duties the following week, as she'd hoped. "These need more time to heal properly," he explained, examining the angry red lines on her forearm. "And you should minimize use of this arm for at least another week. No heavy lifting, no repetitive movements." Michelle left the hospital frustrated. Her physical recovery was taking longer than expected, and she hadn't anticipated the emotional impact of the attack. Nightmares disrupted her sleep nearly every night. Dreams where the bear's paw reached further into the truck, where glass cut deeper, where she couldn't escape in time. The weekend passed slowly. Eleanor called multiple times each day, checking on her sister's recovery and reporting that she'd contacted the Adirondack Daily Enterprise about doing a more detailed story on the bear attack. Michelle was firmly against the idea, and after several heated discussions, Elena reluctantly agreed to drop it. "I just think people should know," her sister insisted during their Sunday call. "What if some hiker encounters that same bear?" "Ranger Santos is handling it," Michelle reminded her. "They've posted warnings in the area, and hikers already know to be bear-aware in the Adirondacks. It's not as if this is the first bear in the mountains. On Monday morning, Michelle met with Mark and the regional postal manager to discuss her return to work. The decision was complicated. Her doctor hadn't cleared her for full duty, but there was also the question of the route itself. "We've been in contact with the DEC," the regional manager explained. "They've increased patrols in the area where the incident occurred, but they can't guarantee that particular bear won't be encountered again." "So what does that mean for my route?" Michelle asked, dreading the answer. "For now, we're implementing some temporary measures," Mark said carefully. "When you're medically cleared to return, you'll have a modified route that avoids the most isolated sections until the DEC gives us an all-clear." Michelle frowned. "Those isolated sections include people who need their mail. The Hendersons, the Collins family, the Petersons. We're arranging alternative delivery methods for those addresses," the regional manager assured her. "Some will temporarily receive mail at secure boxes installed at road intersections before the problematic areas. Others have opted for post office pickup until the situation is resolved." It wasn't ideal, and Michelle worried about her elderly customers who would struggle to travel into town regularly for their mail. But she understood the Postal Service's caution. The attack had been serious, the damage to the vehicle expensive, and her injuries significant enough to raise legitimate safety concerns. As the meeting concluded, Mark mentioned that her replacement truck had arrived from Plattsburgh. The old one was too damaged to repair cost-effectively. "Insurance covered a replacement, though it's not brand new, just newer than what you had." Michelle nodded, feeling a strange sense of loss. She'd driven that postal truck for years, knew every quirk and sound it made. Starting over with an unfamiliar vehicle was yet another small disruption in her carefully ordered routine. Later that day, Michelle visited the DEC office in Ray Brook, hoping to speak with Ranger Santos about the status of the investigation into the bear encounter. The ranger wasn't available, but her colleague provided an update. "We've increased patrols in the area you indicated," he explained, showing Michelle a map with her route highlighted. "There have been 3 confirmed black bear sightings in that zone since your incident, but no further aggressive encounters." "Can you tell if any of those sightings were the same bear?" Michelle asked. The ranger shook his head. "Without distinctive markings or tracking collars, it's difficult to identify individual bears with certainty. But based on the size description and the presence of a yearling cub, at least one sighting might match your bear." Michelle considered this information on her drive home. Part of her was relieved that the bear hadn't attacked anyone else, but another part remained anxious about eventually returning to that area. The logical side of her brain understood that black bear attacks were exceedingly rare, that she'd been incredibly unlucky to experience such an aggressive encounter. The emotional side couldn't forget the terror of that moment, when glass shattered and claws tore through her sleeve. The next week brought gradual improvements. Michelle's facial cuts healed enough that strangers no longer immediately noticed them. The claw marks on her arm remained prominent, but no longer required bulky bandages, just adhesive strips to keep the healing skin protected. She increased her hours at the post office, handling more complex tasks as her strength returned. 10 days after the attack, her doctor cleared her for light duty. No heavy lifting or extended driving, but enough that she could begin the process of returning to at least part of her route. Mark arranged for her to handle the less remote sections, with another carrier taking the areas where the bear had been sighted. The first day back on partial route duty felt both familiar and strange. The replacement truck handled differently than her old one, and Michelle found herself tense and hypervigilant, scanning the roadside constantly for any sign of wildlife. She jumped at unexpected movements, a squirrel darting across the road, a branch swaying in the wind. By the end of the day, her shoulders ached from tension, and she was mentally exhausted from the constant state of alertness. "It'll get easier," Mark assured her when she returned to the post office. "The first day is always the hardest after." Something like this. Michelle nodded, hoping he was right. That night she researched bear deterrents online, reading reviews of different sprays, air horns, and other devices designed to scare off aggressive wildlife. She ordered several items, determined to be better prepared if she ever faced such a situation again. As September gave way to October, the Adirondack forests blazed with autumn colors. Tourist traffic increased as leaf peepers arrived to photograph the spectacular foliage. Michelle's route became busier, with more packages and mail going to seasonal residences whose owners had returned for the fall colors. Gradually, she settled back into her routine, though with modifications. She carried bear spray clipped to her belt at all times. The Postal Service had installed new, louder horns on all rural route vehicles as a precautionary measure. On her phone, Michelle had downloaded a wildlife alert app that allowed carriers to report animal sightings, creating a crowdsourced map of potential hazards. 2 weeks after returning to partial duties, Michelle was called into Mark's office. Ranger Santos was there, along with the regional postal manager. "We've completed our assessment of the bear situation in your route area," Santos began without preamble. "After increased patrols and monitoring, we've determined that the risk level has returned to baseline." "Meaning?" Michelle asked, though she could guess what was coming. "Meaning we believe it's safe for you to resume your full route," the regional manager said, "assuming you feel comfortable doing so." Michelle hesitated. The question was whether she was ready to return to the exact location where the attack had occurred, that isolated stretch of road where a mother bear and her cub had transformed an ordinary workday into a nightmare. "The bears have likely moved on," Ranger Santos added, sensing her hesitation. "This time of year they're focused on finding food sources to fatten up before winter. The behavior you experienced was defensive, not predatory, and unlikely to be repeated unless the same circumstances arose. And if those circumstances do arise again," Michelle asked. "You're better prepared now," the ranger said simply. "You have deterrence, training, and experience, and the Postal Service has implemented new safety protocols. These protocols," the regional manager explained, included check-in procedures for carriers on remote routes, emergency response plans for wildlife encounters, and the option to skip deliveries in areas where bears had been reported as actively present that day. Michelle considered the information. Part of her wanted to say no, to request a permanent reassignment to a safer route. That part remembered the pain, the fear, the moments when she genuinely believed she might not escape. But a larger part recognized that this was her job, her responsibility, her chosen career. The remote residents of her route depended on her service, especially as winter approached and travel would become more difficult. "I'll do it," she said. "Finally. When do I start?" "Monday," Mark said, looking relieved. "We'll arrange for you to have a senior carrier accompany you the first day, just as a precaution." The weekend before her return to full route duties, Michelle drove her personal vehicle along the entire route, including the section where the attack had occurred. She wanted to reacquaint herself with the area in a less pressured situation than a workday. The forest looked different now, the brilliant autumn colors creating a scenic backdrop that belied the danger she'd encountered there. At the exact spot where the bear had first appeared, Michelle stopped her car and sat quietly, looking at the surrounding woods. Nothing moved except leaves dancing in the October breeze. After a few minutes, she continued driving, completing the entire loop of her route without incident. The experience was cathartic in a way she hadn't expected. The road was just a road again, beautiful, remote, but not inherently threatening. The bear had been a natural part of this environment, not a monster, but a wild animal behaving according to its instincts. Understanding this intellectually didn't completely erase her anxiety, but it helped place it in perspective. On Monday morning, Michelle arrived at the post office earlier than usual, giving herself extra time to sort her mail and load the truck. As promised, a senior carrier named Bob was assigned to accompany her, an arrangement that slightly annoyed Michelle despite understanding its purpose. Bob had been delivering mail in the Adirondacks for over 20 years and had his own bear, stories though none involved actual contact. "Most black bears want nothing to do with people," Bob told her as they set out on the route. "They hear a vehicle coming and they're gone before you even see them." "This one didn't get the memo," Michelle said dryly. Bob chuckled. "Every now and then you get an outlier, usually a mother with cubs or a bear that's been fed by humans and lost its natural wariness." The morning portion of the route passed uneventfully. Michelle found the familiar rhythm of deliveries comforting, even with Bob's presence as an unwanted reminder of her recent trauma. The regular customers on her route greeted her warmly, many expressing concern about her injuries and sharing their own wildlife encounter stories. After lunch, they approached the section where the attack had occurred. Michelle felt her heart rate increase slightly, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. Bob noticed but said nothing, simply continuing his casual conversation about fishing spots in the area, providing a welcome distraction. The road was clear as they drove through the formerly problematic section. No bears, no wildlife of any kind visible. The forest was peaceful, the October sunlight filtering through red and gold leaves to create dappled patterns on the pavement. Michelle realized she'd been holding her breath and exhaled slowly. "See, just a regular stretch of road," Bob said as they emerged on the other side. "Beautiful this time of year." Michelle nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. She would always remember what had happened here, would always carry the physical scars on her arm and the faint marks on her face. But the acute fear was subsiding, replaced by a more manageable caution. The same kind of awareness that all rural carriers developed about the various hazards of their routes, from aggressive dogs to icy roads to, yes, occasional wildlife. The remainder of the day passed smoothly. When they returned to the post office, Bob reported to Mark that everything had gone well and that he saw no reason why Michelle couldn't handle the route on her own going forward. Michelle appreciated his vote of confidence, even if the whole arrangement had felt slightly patronizing. That evening, Michelle called her sister to share the news of her successful return to the full route. "I still think you should consider transferring to a city route," Elena said predictably. "Syracuse has openings all the time." "I'm not moving to Syracuse," Michelle replied firmly. "I like it here. I like my route, my customers, even the wildlife most of the time." "You're incredibly stubborn, you know that," Elena sighed. "Promise me you'll at least keep that bear spray with you." "Always," Michelle assured her. "And the new truck has, say, a better horn, and the windows are actually reinforced now. All the rural vehicles are being upgraded gradually." The next day, Michelle handled her route alone. The morning was crisp and clear, perfect weather for driving the mountain roads. As she worked her way through her deliveries, she found herself relaxing more with each completed stop, each uneventful mile. When she reached the Henderson place, Martha invited her in for coffee as usual. This time, instead of her standard, polite refusal, Michelle accepted, deciding she could spare 15 minutes from her schedule. They sat at Martha's kitchen table, the older woman discreetly avoiding staring at the fading marks on Michelle's face. "We were so worried when we heard what happened," Martha said, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs. "Tom Peterson called us right away, said a bear had gone after the mail truck." "News travels fast around here," Michelle observed, accepting the offered coffee gratefully. "It's a small community. We look out for each other." Martha placed a plate of cookies on the table. "Is it true the bear actually broke your window?" Michelle nodded, unconsciously touching the nearly healed cuts on her cheek. "It was protecting its cub. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." "Will you keep delivering out this way?" Martha asked, her concern evident. "No one would blame you if you didn't want to. This is my route," Michelle said simply. "I'm not giving it up because of one bad day." Martha smiled, reaching across the table to pat Michelle's hand. "That's the spirit. Can't let fear rule your life, especially out here. Nature is beautiful, but demands respect." After finishing her coffee, Michelle continued her route with renewed confidence. The conversation with Martha had reinforced what she already knew deep down, that this was where she belonged, doing work that mattered to the people who had chosen, like her, to make their homes in this remote, beautiful, sometimes challenging landscape. As she approached the section where the attack had occurred, Michelle remained alert, but not anxious. She drove through without incident, noting that the DEC had installed new bear warning signs at either end of the stretch. The signs indicated proper behavior if a bear was spotted. "Stay in your vehicle, do not approach, report sightings to the listed number." The rest of October passed peacefully. Michelle fell back into her routine, the incident gradually fading from immediate memory to become simply another experience in her years as a rural carrier. The physical reminders remained: 3 parallel scars on her forearm that the doctor said would likely be permanent, and 2 smaller scars on her face that were barely noticeable unless she pointed them out. Emotionally, the impact lingered in subtle ways. Michelle was more cautious on isolated roads, more likely to slow down and thoroughly scan the surroundings before proceeding through heavily wooded areas. She never went on her route without bear spray clipped to her belt, and she'd developed the habit of keeping her truck windows closed completely in areas where visibility into the forest was limited. These were reasonable precautions, adaptations rather than limitations. In early November, as the autumn colors faded and the first hints of winter appeared in morning frost and occasional snow flurries, Michelle received word that her experience had led to policy changes within the regional postal service. All rural carriers were now required to complete enhanced wildlife safety training. Vehicles were being gradually upgraded with reinforced windows and more effective horns, and a formal reporting system for wildlife sightings had been implemented. Thafi, story of her bear encounter, had spread throughout the postal carrier community in the Adirondack region, taking on the qualities of a cautionary tale. When Michelle attended a regional postal worker meeting in Lake Placid, several carriers she'd never met approached her, wanting to hear the story firsthand. She told it factually, without embellishment, emphasizing the importance of preparation. and protocol rather than dwelling on the fear and danger. As winter settled over the mountains, bringing snow that transformed her route into a postcard-perfect landscape of white-dusted pines and frozen lakes, Michelle found herself watching for different hazards. Icy patches, snowdrifts, the occasional moose crossing the road. Bears were no longer an immediate concern, as most had entered their winter dormancy period, conserving energy in dens until spring would bring new food sources. On a December morning, as Michelle delivered mail to a cabin near where the attack had occurred, she noticed fresh bear tracks in the newly fallen snow, unusual this late in the season. They were heading away from the road into the deeper forest, large paw prints with the distinctive five-toe pattern of a black bear. Smaller tracks paralleled the larger ones, a cub now nearly grown still following its mother. Michelle stood for a moment, looking at the tracks disappearing among the trees. She felt no fear, only a quiet acknowledgement of the wild creature that had briefly and violently intersected with her life before returning to its natural home in these vast mountains. The bear was doing what bears do, surviving, protecting its young, following ancient instincts in a world increasingly shaped by human presence. Returning to her truck, Michelle continued her route, the snow crunching beneath her boots. The scars on her arm itched slightly beneath her heavy winter coat, a physical reminder of that September day that had changed her in ways both obvious and subtle. She was the same Michelle Rodriguez who had driven these roads for years, delivering mail to the far-flung residents of the Adirondacks. And yet she was different too. More cautious perhaps, more aware of the wild world that existed alongside the human one, but also more confident in her ability to face unexpected challenges. As she drove through the gently falling snow, Michelle reflected that this was the reality of choosing to live and work in places where wilderness still held sway. There were risks, occasionally even dangers, but also extraordinary beauty and a sense of connection to something larger than oneself. Her encounter with the bear had been a rare, frightening anomaly, but it hadn't defined her relationship with these mountains or her commitment to the job she had chosen. The postcard-perfect winter scene stretched before her, her truck leaving the only tracks on the snow-covered road. Ahead lay more deliveries, more human connections in isolated places, more reminders of why she had chosen this particular life. Michelle adjusted her route map on the seat beside her and drove on, alert but unafraid, carrying messages between people across this wild, beautiful landscape she called home. Peter Collins squinted through the eyepiece of his telescope, adjusting the focus until the rings of Saturn sharpened against the velvet backdrop of the night sky. The crisp New Hampshire air filled his lungs as he straightened up, stretching, his back after nearly an hour hunched over his equipment. At 43, Peter wasn't as limber as he'd once been, but his passion for astronomy remained undimmed since childhood. The small clearing behind his cabin offered a perfect vantage point, far enough from light pollution to reveal celestial wonders that remained invisible to city dwellers. He checked his watch, just past 11. The night was still young for an astronomer. Peter had taken Friday off work specifically for this weekend's exceptional viewing conditions, clear skies, a new moon, and a meteor shower predicted for later. His software engineering job in Boston allowed him the flexibility to work remotely, though he typically saved his cabin retreats for weekends and holidays. This White Mountain getaway, purchased 5 years ago after his divorce, had become his sanctuary, a place where the complexity of algorithms gave way to the elegant simplicity of stellar mechanics. The cabin itself was modest, 2 bedrooms, a combined kitchen and living area, and a small bathroom, but it suited Peter perfectly. He'd made a few improvements since purchasing it, reinforced the roof, updated the plumbing, and installed solar panels that supplemented the grid electricity. His latest addition had been motion-activated security lights around the perimeter, more to help him navigate at night than out of any serious security concerns. The previous owner had warned him about occasional wildlife visitors, mostly deer and raccoons, but Peter had only caught glimpses of them in the 2 years since. The lights were installed. He turned toward the cabin, its warm light spilling from the open door onto the wooden deck. Peter had left it open to grab a thermos of coffee between observations, not bothering to close it for what would be a brief trip outside. Inside, the remnants of his dinner, a hearty venison stew he'd prepared earlier, still sat in a pot on the stove, the scent lingering in the air. He'd meant to clean up before starting his stargazing session, but had been eager to set up while the skies were clear. One more look at Jupiter before coffee, Peter murmured to himself, turning back to his telescope. The gas giant had been particularly spectacular tonight, its bands clearly visible along with 3 of its moons. He made a minor adjustment to the tracking system, compensating for Earth's rotation to keep the planet centered in his view. The forest surrounding his property was unusually quiet tonight. Typically, the spring evenings were filled with peeper frogs and the occasional owl, but Peter was too absorbed in his observations to notice the silence. May in New Hampshire meant comfortable nights for stargazing, cool enough to keep mosquitoes at bay but warm enough that he needed only a light jacket. After several more minutes of observation, Peter decided it was time for that coffee. He carefully noted his findings in the astronomy journal he kept, documenting atmospheric conditions and visibility. Organization had always been his strong suit, both in his professional and personal pursuits. His ex-wife had sometimes teased him about his meticulous nature, but these careful records had helped him track optimal viewing conditions over the years. As Peter stepped away from his telescope and turned toward the cabin, a flicker of movement caught his eye from the tree line. He paused, squinting into the darkness beyond the reach of his porch light. Probably a deer, he thought, or maybe a raccoon investigating his property. Wildlife encounters were part of the charm of cabin life, though he was careful not to leave food outside that might attract unwanted visitors. The coffee beckoned, and Peter walked the short distance to his cabin, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path he'd laid last summer. The night air had grown cooler, and he looked forward to wrapping his hands around a warm mug. He reached the wooden deck and climbed the 3 steps to the door, his mind already shifting to which celestial body he would observe next. As he crossed the threshold into the kitchen, Peter froze. Something was wrong, a subtle change in the air, a presence that hadn't been there when he'd left. Then he heard it, a soft snuffling sound coming from around the corner of the breakfast bar that partially divided the kitchen from the living area. Peter's heart rate accelerated as he slowly, quietly, took another step inside. The cabin's interior, lighting cast long shadows across the wooden floor. He inched forward, trying to make out what was causing the noise without startling whatever it might be. He didn't have to wait long. A large black bear ambled into view from behind the breakfast bar, its snout raised as it sniffed the air. The bear was inside his cabin, barely 10 feet away, its attention focused on the pot of stew sitting on the stove. Peter's breath caught in his throat. The bear was bigger than he'd imagined a black bear would be, easily several 100 pounds, its black fur glossy under the kitchen lights. In his 5 years of ownership, he'd never had a bear enter the cabin, though he'd seen warning signs posted throughout the area and had heard stories from neighbors about sightings. The bear hadn't noticed him yet, its attention fixed on the food source it had detected. Peter's mind raced through what little he knew about bear encounters. Don't run, make yourself look big, back away slowly. But those rules were for outdoor encounters. What about a bear that had already entered your home? He took a silent step backward, hoping to retreat before the animal became aware of his presence. His heel caught the edge of the doormat, causing a barely perceptible scraping sound against the wooden floor. It was enough. The bear's head swung toward him, dark eyes locking onto Peter's. Time seemed to stretch as human and bear regarded each other, mutual surprise evident in their frozen postures. The bear recovered first. It let out a huff of air that sounded almost like an expression of annoyance at being interrupted during its foraging. It took a ponderous step toward Peter, its nose working overtime to process the competing scents of human and food. Peter's survival instinct finally kicked in. He began backing away, moving onto the deck without taking his eyes off the bear. "Hey," he said, his voice higher than normal. "Hey there, bear, I'm just going to go and you can do whatever bears do." The sound of his voice seemed to increase the bear's curiosity rather than deter it. It continued its advance, moving with surprising grace for an animal its size. Peter kept backing up until he reached the railing of his deck. He was outside now, but the bear was following, framed in the doorway of his cabin. For a moment, Peter considered his options. The telescope was to his right, about 15 feet away. His truck was parked further down the gravel driveway, a good 40 yards from where he stood. Neither seemed like a viable sanctuary with a bear between him and the only path that led to the driveway. The bear emerged fully onto the deck, its massive form blocking the light from the cabin. Peter edged along the railing, hoping to circle around toward the steps that led down to the yard. If he could just get past the bear, he could run for the truck. "Easy," Peter said, trying to keep his voice steady, "just passing through." The bear huffed again, then dropped to all fours. Rather than making it seem smaller, the posture emphasized the animal's muscular build and the alarming speed with which it could move. Peter had nearly reached the corner of the deck when the bear suddenly lunged forward. Peter reacted instinctively, turning to flee. He made it 2 steps before realizing his mistake. He'd cornered himself. The bear cut off his path to the stairs, and now Peter was trapped against the railing with nowhere to go. The bear rose up again, towering over Peter. It let out a low growl that vibrated through the wooden planks beneath his feet. Peter raised his arms, trying to appear larger while searching desperately for anything that might serve as a deterrent. There was nothing within reach. "Back off!" Peter shouted, hoping volume might compensate for his disadvantage in size. The bear swiped at him, a casual motion that seemed almost lazy until its paw connected with Peter's chest. He felt a searing pain as claws tore through his jacket and the shirt beneath, cutting into his flesh. The force of the blow sent him staggering backward against the railing, which creaked ominously under the sudden pressure. Blood bloomed across Peter's chest, dark against his light blue jacket. The pain was immediate and intense, radiating outward. From 3 parallel gashes, he gasped, pressing his hand against the wounds as if he could somehow push the pain back in. The bear advanced again, seemingly encouraged by the effect of its first strike. Peter was certain this was it. He was about to become a statistic, another unfortunate tale of wilderness gone wrong. Then, salvation arrived from an unexpected source. The motion-activated security lights that lined the edge of the property suddenly blazed to life, triggered by their movement. The sudden flood of bright light startled both Peter and the bear. The animal flinched, backing up a step and turning its head away from the harsh illumination. Peter seized the moment. Ignoring the pain lancing through his chest, he lunged to the side, making it past the bear to the stairs. He half ran, half fell down the steps, his only thought to put distance between himself and the predator. The bear hesitated, momentarily, confused by the lights and Peter's sudden movement. By the time it turned its attention back to him, Peter had stumbled several yards into the yard. The bear huffed loudly, stepping down from the deck with deliberate slowness. Peter continued, backing away, keeping his eyes on the bear. His chest throbbed with each heartbeat, and he could feel warm blood soaking through his clothes. The metallic scent reached his nostrils, and he worried it might further incite the bear. "Go on," Peter said, waving his arm in a shooing motion that sent fresh pain through his injuries. "Go back to the woods. The stew's all yours." Whether it was the lights, Peter's distance, or the bear's own calculation that the food inside was a safer bet than pursuing the human, something changed in its demeanor. It gave one more huff, shook its massive head, then turned and ambled back toward the cabin, disappearing inside through the still open door. Peter didn't wait to see what it would do next. He staggered toward his truck, fumbling in his pocket for his keys. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain across his chest, and he could feel his clothes sticking to the wounds. He reached the vehicle, yanked open the door, and collapsed into the driver's seat. His hands shook as he inserted the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Peter threw the truck into reverse, backing down the gravel driveway without bothering to close his door properly. Only when he reached the main road did he pull over long enough to secure the door and assess his injuries. The light in the truck cab revealed 3 long gashes across his chest, starting near his right shoulder and extending diagonally to just above his left ribs. They weren't as deep as he'd feared. The layers of clothing had provided some protection, but they were bleeding steadily. Peter pressed his wadded-up jacket against the wounds, wincing at the pressure. His mind raced. The nearest hospital was in North Conway, about 25 minutes away. He could make it there, assuming the blood loss didn't make him too dizzy to drive. Alternatively, there was a small urgent care clinic in the town of Jackson, just 10 minutes in the opposite direction, but he wasn't sure if they'd be equipped to handle animal attacks. Hospital, he decided. Better to be safe than sorry. Peter put the truck in drive and headed south toward North Conway, pressing his jacket against his chest with one hand while steering with the other. Each bump in the road sent fresh pain through his wounds, and he found himself holding his breath, then remembering to exhale. As he drove, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. A bear, an actual black bear, had entered his cabin and attacked him. It seemed surreal, like something that happened to other people, the kind of story you read about in local newspapers, not something that happened to a software engineer from Boston who just wanted to look at stars. The adrenaline that had carried him through the encounter was beginning to wane, leaving him shaky and cold. Shock, he thought. That's shock setting in. He turned up the heater in the truck, hoping the warmth would help. The 25-minute drive to the hospital seemed to stretch into hours. Peter found himself repeatedly checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the bear following him down the darkened highway. Rational thought told him that was impossible, but fear wasn't rational. Memorial Hospital appeared ahead, its illuminated emergency entrance a welcome sight. Peter pulled into a parking space near the ER doors and cut the engine. For a moment he sat there, gathering his strength for the walk inside. The bleeding had slowed somewhat, but his jacket was soaked through, and the pain had settled into a persistent throbbing that intensified with any movement. Taking a deep breath, Peter pushed open the truck door and staggered toward the entrance. The automatic doors parted before him, and he stepped into the brightly lit reception area. A nurse behind the desk looked up, her expression shifting from professional welcome to alarm as she registered his blood-soaked appearance. "I need help," Peter said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "Bear attack at my cabin." The nurse was already in motion, calling for assistance while coming around the desk to help him. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" "Peter Collins," he managed. "It was in my kitchen. A black bear." Another nurse and an orderly appeared with a wheelchair. Peter sank into it gratefully, the edges of his vision beginning to darken. He was guided through another set of doors into the treatment area, voices swirling around him as medical staff assessed his condition. "BP is 160, heart rate elevated at 110. Let's get these clothes off and see what we're dealing with. Sir, are you allergic to any medications?" Peter tried to focus to answer their questions, but the combination of pain, blood loss, and delayed shock was making it difficult to concentrate. He felt hands removing his blood-soaked shirt, heard a sharp intake of breath as his wounds were revealed. "Get Dr. Ramirez in here," someone said. "We've got 3 deep lacerations, approximately 20 centimeters in length, consistent with animal claws." A new face appeared in Peter's field of vision, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a white coat over blue scrubs. "Mr. Collins, I'm Dr. Ramirez. You've been attacked by a bear, is that correct?" Peter nodded. "In my cabin. It was inside when I came back from stargazing. We're going to take good care of you," she assured him. "These wounds need cleaning and stitching, and we'll want to start you on antibiotics to prevent infection. Animal scratches can harbor a lot of bacteria." "Am I going to be okay?" Peter asked, suddenly aware of how serious the situation might be. "You're going to be fine," Dr. Ramirez said firmly. "The cuts are significant, but they don't appear to have damaged any major blood vessels or organs. You were lucky." Lucky wasn't exactly how Peter would have described it, but he understood her point. It could have been much worse. What followed was a blur of activity. His wounds were cleaned thoroughly, a process that was almost as painful as the initial injury, and local anesthetic was administered before Dr. Ramirez began the meticulous work of stitching the gashes closed. Peter tried not to look, focusing instead on the ceiling tiles and answering questions about his medical history. "Have you had a tetanus shot in the last 5 years?" a nurse asked, preparing an injection. "Yes," Peter said, 3 years ago when I cut myself building the deck." The irony wasn't lost on him. The same deck where the bear had attacked him. "That's good," she replied. "We'll still be giving you a broad-spectrum antibiotic, and Dr. Ramirez will prescribe more for you to take at home." It was nearly 2 hours later when the immediate treatment was complete. Peter lay on the examination table, his chest wrapped in clean white bandages, an IV delivering fluids and antibiotics into his arm. The pain had subsided to a dull ache thanks to the medication they'd administered. Dr. Ramirez returned, clipboard in hand. "How are you feeling, Mr. Collins?" "Better," Peter said, though exhausted would have been more accurate. "Thank you. We've closed your wounds with 47 stitches total," she informed him. "You'll need to keep the area clean and dry and return in 7 days to have them checked. I'm prescribing antibiotics for 2 weeks and pain medication as needed." She paused. "Have you reported the attack to Fish and Game?" Peter shook his head. "I came straight here." "We're required to report animal attacks," she explained. "Someone from New Hampshire Fish and Game will probably want to speak with you. Black bear attacks are rare, especially ones where the bear enters a home." "The door was open," Peter admitted. "I was just stepping out for a bit of stargazing. I left dinner on the stove." Dr. Ramirez nodded, making a note. "That would explain. Bears have an incredible sense of smell, especially this time of year when they're coming out of hibernation and looking for food." "What happens now?" Peter asked. "To the bear, I mean. That will be up to Fish and Game," she said. "Usually they try to identify and relocate problem bears, but it depends on the circumstances." She glanced at her watch. "We'd like to keep you for a few more hours for observation. Make sure there's no sign of infection starting. Do you have someone who can drive you home later?" Peter thought about it. His closest friend in the area was Mark Levinson, who owned a neighboring cabin about a mile down the road. They weren't particularly close, mostly exchanging pleasantries when their visits overlapped, but he couldn't think of anyone else to call at 1 in the morning. "I might," he said. "Can I use a phone?" Dr. Ramirez pointed to the phone on the place and dial 9 for an outside line. "I'll check on you again before the end of my shift." Left alone, Peter dialed Mark's number, hoping his neighbor was at his cabin this weekend. After 4 rings, a groggy voice answered. "Hello? Mark? It's Peter Collins from up the road." "Peter?" Mark sounded confused. "It's the middle of the night. What's wrong?" "I'm sorry to wake you," Peter said. "I'm at Memorial Hospital in North Conway. I had an incident with a bear at my cabin. I need a ride home in a few hours. I hate to ask, but..." "A bear?" Mark was suddenly alert. "Are you okay?" "I will be. Some nasty cuts, but nothing life-threatening. I'll come get you," Mark said immediately. "What time?" "They want to keep me until around 4, just to be safe. I'll be there. Do you need anything?" "From your cabin? Clothes, wallet?" Peter hesitated. "I don't think I want to go back there right now. The bear was still inside when I left." "Right," Mark said. "Probably a good call. I'll bring some clothes you can borrow." "Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate it." After hanging up, Peter leaned back against the pillows, fatigue washing over him. The night had taken a surreal turn, transforming from peaceful stargazing to a fight for his life in moments. He closed his eyes, but immediately snapped them open again as his mind replayed the image of the bear rising up before him, paw raised for that devastating swipe. Sleep wasn't going to come easily tonight, even with the pain medication dulling his senses. Peter reached for the TV remote instead, hoping the mindless distraction of late-night programming might keep the bear at bay, at least in his thoughts. The hours passed slowly. Nurses came and went, checking his vital signs and changing his V-bag. Dr. Ramirez returned once more before the end of her shift, examining his bandages and expressing satisfaction with his condition. "Your friend is here," she told him. "We'll get your discharge papers ready." Mark appeared in the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. At 52, he was about a decade older than Peter, with salt and pepper hair and the weathered look of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. He worked as a high school science teacher in Massachusetts, but spent most weekends and school breaks at his cabin. "You look like hell," Mark said by way of greeting. "Thanks," Peter replied dryly. "You should see the other guy." Mark chuckled, setting a duffel bag on the chair beside the bed. "Brought you some clothes. They might be a bit big, but better than what you came in with." He nodded toward the bloody remains of Peter's shirt and jacket, which had been placed in a hospital bag. "I appreciate it," Peter said. "And the ride. I know it's an imposition." "Don't mention it," Mark waved away his thanks. "Neighbors help neighbors, especially when bears are involved. Speaking of which, what exactly happened?" Peter recounted the evening's events while a nurse helped him disconnect from the IV and handed him a stack of discharge papers and prescriptions. Mark listened intently, whistling lowly when Peter described the bear's size. "Probably a male," Mark said. "The females don't usually get that big. Was it tagged? Any collar or ear markers?" "I didn't notice," Peter admitted. "I was too busy trying not to become its midnight snack." The nurse provided final instructions on wound care and warning signs of infection. "Any redness that spreads beyond the immediate area, increased pain, fever, or unusual drainage, come back immediately," she emphasized. "Bear claws harbor all sorts of bacteria." "I will," Peter promised, signing the last of the forms. With Mark's help, Peter changed into the borrowed clothes, sweatpants and a button-up flannel shirt that was easier to manage with his injured chest than trying to raise his arms for a t-shirt. Walking was uncomfortable but manageable, and he made it to Mark's SUV without assistance. The pre-dawn air was crisp as they emerged from the hospital, the sky beginning to lighten in the east. Peter settled into the passenger seat, adjusting the position to minimize pressure on his wounds. "Where to?" Mark asked, starting the engine. "My place? We should probably call Fish and Game before going back to yours." "Your place, if that's okay," Peter agreed. "I need to sleep, and I'm not sure I could do that at my cabin right now anyway." The drive back was quiet, both men lost in their thoughts. The landscape passed by in a blur of shadowy trees and occasional houses, the familiar route seeming somehow different in the aftermath of the attack. Peter found himself scanning the roadsides, half expecting to see bears lurking behind every tree. Mark's cabin was similar to Peter's in style, but larger, with a wraparound porch and a detached garage. He helped Peter inside and showed him to the guest bedroom. "Bathrooms across the hall," Mark said. "I put out towels and a spare toothbrush. Get some rest. We can figure out the next steps when you wake up." "Thanks again," Peter said suddenly, overwhelmed by exhaustion, "for everything. That's what neighbors are for, Mark replied, especially in bear country. Left alone, Peter carefully lowered himself onto the bed, mindful of his bandaged chest. Despite his earlier certainty that sleep would elude him, he found himself drifting off almost immediately, the combination of pain medication and exhaustion finally winning out over adrenaline and fear. He woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, Peter was disoriented. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back. He winced as he sat up, the movement pulling at his stitches despite the bandages. A glance at the bedside clock showed it was past noon. Peter had slept for nearly 8 hours, yet he still felt drained. He made his way to the bathroom, where he carefully removed the bandages to inspect his wounds for the first time in proper lighting. 3 angry red lines traced across his chest, the edges pulled together with neat black stitches. The surrounding skin was bruised and swollen, a vivid testament to the bear's power. Looking at the damage, Peter marveled again at his luck. A few inches higher, or with slightly more force, and the outcome could have been far worse. He replaced the bandages with fresh ones from the supplies the hospital had provided, then made his way to the kitchen, following the smell of coffee. Mark was seated at a large wooden table, a mug in one hand and a newspaper in the other. He looked up as Peter entered. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Peter admitted, easing himself into a chair. "But I'll live." Mark poured him a cup of coffee. "I called Fish and Game while you were sleeping. They're sending someone out to your cabin to assess the situation and set up a trap." "Her trap?" Peter frowned. "They're going to kill it?" "Not necessarily," Mark explained. "They'll try to relocate it first, but they take bears entering homes very seriously. This one has learned that houses contain food, which makes it dangerous." Peter nodded slowly, processing this information. He understood the reasoning, but still felt a strange reluctance to condemn the animal for following its instincts. "I left the door open with food cooking," he pointed out. "I practically invited it in." "Bears don't need much invitation," Mark said, "especially this time of year. They're hungry after winter." "What about my place? My telescope is still out there and all my stuff." "The officers said they'd secure your cabin if the bear is gone. If not, they'll deal with that first." Mark slid a cell phone across the table. "Your phone was in your jacket pocket. Battery's dead, but it survived." Peter picked it up gratefully. "I should call work. Let them know I won't be in on Monday." "There's a charger by the couch," Mark offered, "and you're welcome to stay here as long as you need." After breakfast and a phone call to his supervisor explaining the situation, which was met with equal parts concern and fascination, Peter took his prescribed antibiotics and pain medication. The latter made him drowsy, and he spent most of the afternoon dozing on Mark's couch, drifting in and out of consciousness as his body began the healing process. It was late afternoon when a knock at the door roused him. Mark answered it, admitting a uniformed officer from New Hampshire Fish and Game. The man introduced himself as Officer Mike Thornton, a wildlife specialist who had been assigned to Peter's case. "Mr. Collins." Thornton was in his early 40s, with a practical haircut and the lean build of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. "How are you feeling?" "I've been better," Peter said, carefully sitting up. "Did you check my cabin?" Thornton nodded, taking a seat in the armchair opposite the couch. "We secured it. The bear was gone when we arrived, but it did quite a number on your kitchen. Knocked over the pot on the stove, opened your refrigerator, scattered food everywhere." Peter winced, imagining the devastation. "Any sign of it coming back?" "There were tracks around the property," Thornton confirmed. "We've set up a culvert trap with some bait. If it returns, we'll catch it." "And then what?" Peter asked. "That depends," Thornton said. "First offense, healthy bear, we'd normally relocate it to a less populated area. But entering a home escalates things." He pulled out a notepad. "I need to ask you some questions about the encounter if you're up to it." Peter nodded, recounting the events of the previous night in as much detail as he could remember. Thornton took notes, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. "You said you left your door open while stargazing?" Thornton asked. "Yes," Peter admitted. "I know now that was a mistake." "And there was food cooking on the stove?" "It was done cooking, but yes, the pot was still there." "Venison stew." Thornton made another note. "Bears have an incredible sense of smell. They can detect food from over a mile away. Between the open door and the scent of meat, you essentially created a perfect invitation." Peter nodded, feeling a growing sense of responsibility for the encounter. "So this is really my fault." "I wouldn't go that far," Thornton said. "Bears are opportunistic by nature. This one took advantage of an opportunity you presented, but that doesn't mean the attack was your fault. Once confronted, bears can be unpredictable, especially if they feel cornered." "What can I do to prevent this from happening again?" Peter asked. "Several things," Thornton replied, seeming pleased by the question. "First, never leave doors or windows open when you're not directly watching them, especially if there's food inside. Second, proper food storage is essential. Secure trash in bear-resistant containers, clean grills thoroughly after use, don't leave pet food outside, and consider using a bear-proof food storage locker for any outdoor supplies." He continued, "We also recommend motion-activated lights and noise deterrents around the property. I noticed you already have the lights, which probably saved you from a worse attack." "They startled it enough for me to get away," Peter confirmed. "That's consistent with black bear behavior," Thornton nodded. "They're naturally cautious and will often retreat when startled, unlike grizzlies, which might become more aggressive if surprised." "Thank goodness we don't have grizzlies in New Hampshire," Peter remarked. "Small blessings," Thornton agreed with a small smile. "Now, I've left some educational materials at your cabin along with my card. We'll check the trap daily, but if you see the bear again before we catch it, call immediately. Don't approach it even to take pictures." "Believe me, I have no desire to get any closer to it," Peter assured him. After Thornton left, Peter discussed with Mark the prospect of returning to his cabin. "I should at least assess the damage," he said. "Maybe grab some of my own clothes and necessities." "We can drive over tomorrow," Mark suggested. "Fish and Game said it's secure and they've got the trap set if the bear comes back." Peter agreed, though the thought of returning to the scene of the attack sent a flutter of anxiety through his chest. He spent another night in Mark's guest room, his sleep punctuated by dreams of gleaming black fur and flashing claws. The following morning, feeling marginally better after another dose of antibiotics and pain medication, Peter accompanied Mark to his cabin. The drive was short but tense, at least for Peter, who found himself scanning the trees with a new wariness. They pulled into his gravel driveway just before noon. The familiar sight of his cabin should have been comforting, but Peter felt only apprehension as they approached. His telescope still stood in the clearing where he'd left it, seemingly untouched by the bear or the subsequent visit from Fish and Game. Mark parked beside Peter's truck, which he'd abandoned at the hospital. "Ready?" he asked, giving Peter a concerned glance. "As I'll ever be," Peter replied, pushing open the car door. The cabin appeared unchanged from the outside, though Peter could see the culvert trap Thornton had mentioned positioned at the edge of the woods. It resembled a large metal tube with a trapdoor baited to lure the bear inside. Peter approached his front door with caution, noting that Fish and Game had installed a temporary hasp and padlock to secure it. The key had been left with Mark. As they unlocked and opened the door, the smell hit them immediately. A combination of spoiled food, overturned trash, and a musky, wild odor that Peter assumed was the bear itself. The interior of the cabin was in disarray. The pot of stew had indeed been knocked from the stove onto the floor, its contents splattered across the kitchen. The refrigerator door hung open, its contents ransacked. Packages of food had been torn open, containers upended, and items Peter had never considered edible had been taste-tested and discarded. Beyond the kitchen, the damage was less severe but still evident. Cushions had been pulled from the couch, a lamp knocked over, and various items scattered as if the bear had conducted a thorough but careless search of the premises. "Well," Mark said after a moment of stunned silence, "at least the structure is intact. Bears sometimes tear through walls or windows if they smell food they can't reach." Peter nodded numbly, surveying what would be an extensive cleanup effort. "I guess I should be grateful for small mercies." They ventured further inside, Peter noting with relief that his bedroom appeared untouched. His computer, wallet, and other valuables were where he'd left them. The bear had been interested solely in potential food sources. "Let's grab what you need," Mark suggested. "We can come back for a proper cleanup when you're feeling stronger." Peter collected some clothes, his laptop, phone charger, and a few personal items. As he was zipping his duffel bag, a movement outside the window caught his eye. He froze, then cautiously approached the glass. A New Hampshire Fish and Game truck was pulling into his driveway, Officer Thornton at the wheel. Peter and Mark went outside to meet him. "Mr. Collins," Thornton greeted him, "I see you've come to inspect the damage." "Just gathering some essentials," Peter explained. "It's quite a mess in there." Thornton nodded sympathetically. "Bears are not known for their housekeeping skills. I came to check the trap and wanted to see if you'd returned." He glanced at the cabin. "Have you decided when you'll be moving back in?" The question caught Peter off guard. He hadn't really thought that far ahead. The idea of sleeping in the cabin where the attack had occurred was unsettling, but it was his home, his sanctuary. Could he abandon it over one bad experience? "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I need to clean up first, and I'm still healing." Understandable, Thornton said. Just keep me updated on your plans. If you're not going to be here regularly, we may need to adjust our monitoring of the area. I will, Peter promised. After, Thornton checked the empty trap and departed. Peter and Mark locked up the cabin and headed back to Mark's place. The visit had left Peter with mixed emotions. Relief that the damage was primarily superficial, but anxiety at the thought of reclaiming his space after such a traumatic experience. The next few days fell into a pattern. Peter took his medications, rested, and began the slow process of healing. Mark drove him to his follow-up appointment at the hospital, where Dr. Ramirez pronounced his wounds to be healing nicely, with no signs of infection. "You're lucky," she told him, carefully applying fresh bandages. Bear claws can introduce all sorts of bacteria, but the antibiotics seem to be doing their job. "When can I go back to work?" Peter asked. "I'd recommend another week of limited activity," she advised. "Those stitches need time to do their job, and you don't want to tear them with too much movement. Are you planning to return to your cabin soon?" Peter hesitated. "I'm not sure yet. It needs cleaning. And honestly, I'm still a bit apprehensive." Dr. Ramirez nodded understandingly. "That's a normal reaction to trauma. Give yourself time. There's no rush to face that particular fear until you're ready." By the 5th day after the attack, Peter was feeling restless. Mark had been an exemplary host, but Peter was conscious of imposing on his hospitality. Moreover, Mark needed to return to Massachusetts for the work week, and Peter had to make a decision about his immediate plans. "I could go back to Boston for a while," Peter mused over dinner that evening. "Work remotely until I'm fully healed, then decide about the cabin." "That's an option," Mark agreed. "Or you could stay here while I'm gone. I don't mind." Peter considered the offer. Staying at Mark's place would keep him close to his own cabin, allowing him to check on it and perhaps begin the cleanup process. It would also mean confronting his new fear of the woods, rather than retreating to the safety of the city. "I think I'll take you up on that," Peter decided. "If you're sure it's not an imposition." "Not at all," Mark assured him. "Just keep an eye on the place for me, and maybe don't leave any doors open with food cooking," he added with a wry smile. Peter winced at the reminder, but appreciated Mark's attempt to lighten the mood. Lesson definitely learned on that front. The following day, Mark departed for Massachusetts, leaving Peter with a spare key and the run of his cabin. It felt strange to be alone again after several days of company, but Peter welcomed the solitude to process his thoughts. That afternoon, he received a call from Officer Thornton. "We caught a bear in the trap near your property," Thornton informed him. Peter's heartbeat quickened. "Is it the one that attacked me?" "We believe so," Thornton said. "It's a large male, approximately 300 pounds. No previous tagging or history with fish and game." "What happens now?" Peter asked, torn between relief that the bear had been captured and a strange sense of responsibility for its fate. "We've transported it to a remote area in northern New Hampshire for release," Thornton explained. Given the circumstances and the bear's lack of prior human encounters, relocation was deemed appropriate. However, I should warn you that bears can travel great distances, and there's no guarantee it won't return to the area eventually. "I understand," Peter said. "I'll be more careful in the future." "That's all anyone can ask," Thornton replied. "Will you be returning to your cabin soon?" "I'm staying at my neighbor's place for now," Peter explained. "I'll probably go over to clean up in the next day or two." "Good. Removing any remaining food sources is important. Bears have excellent memories when it comes to food locations." After the call, Peter sat on Mark's porch, contemplating his next steps. The bear had been caught and relocated, one obstacle removed, but the psychological barrier remained. Could he return to his own cabin, to his stargazing and solitary weekends, without constantly looking over his shoulder? The next morning, Peter drove to his cabin, determined to, at least, begin the cleanup process. The day was bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring weather that had drawn him to New Hampshire in the first place. He parked in the driveway, noting that the culvert trap had been removed following the bear's capture. Unlocking the door, he braced himself for the smell, which had undoubtedly worsened after several more days. He wasn't disappointed. The odor of spoiled food and wild animal was even more pungent than before. Peter propped the door open to air out the cabin and began the systematic process of cleaning. He started in the kitchen, disposing of all the ruined food and scrubbing every surface with disinfectant. The work was physically demanding, pulling at his healing wounds, but also therapeutic in a way, reclaiming his space inch by inch. By mid-afternoon, he had made significant progress on the kitchen and was moving to the living area when his phone rang. It was his supervisor from work, checking on his recovery. "We miss you around here, Pete," she said after he'd assured her he was on the mend. When do you think you'll be back? Next week, probably, Peter told her. Working remotely at first. If that's okay. Whatever you need, she assured him. Not everyone can claim a bear attack as their reason for sick leave. You've become something of a legend in the office. Peter chuckled, though the humor felt slightly hollow. Not the kind of fame I was aiming for. After finishing the call, Peter returned to his cleaning efforts. By evening, the cabin was beginning to resemble its former self, though the lingering smell would take more time to dissipate. He collected his telescope from the yard, carefully storing it in its case after checking for damage. Remarkably, it had survived the ordeal unscathed. As dusk approached, Peter found himself increasingly uneasy. Every rustle from the surrounding woods made him tense, and the idea of spending the night alone in the cabin was becoming less appealing by the minute. Logical thought told him the bear was gone, relocated far away, but fear didn't always listen to logic. He finished what cleaning he could manage with his limited stamina, then locked up the cabin and returned to Mark's place for the night. The decision felt like a small defeat, but Peter reminded himself that recovery, both physical and psychological, was a process, not an event. The following days established a new routine. Peter would spend the daylight hours at his cabin, continuing the cleanup and gradually reclaiming his space. He started working remotely, reconnecting with his team, and focusing on programming problems that demanded his full attention, providing a welcome distraction from thoughts of the attack. In the evenings, he would return to Mark's cabin, unable to overcome the anxiety that intensified as darkness fell. He spoke with Mark several times by phone, keeping him updated on both cabins and discussing his gradual progress. It's only been a week, Mark reminded him, when Peter expressed frustration at his lingering fear. Give yourself time. You went through something traumatic. I know, Peter sighed. It just feels, I don't know, irrational. The bear is gone. The cabin is secure. There's no logical reason to be afraid. Fear isn't always logical, Mark pointed out. It's an instinct that kept our ancestors alive. Your brain is just trying to protect you from a threat it perceives as real. By the 10th day after the attack, Peter had his stitches removed at a follow-up appointment. Dr. Ramirez examined the healing wounds, which were forming distinct scars across his chest. These will fade somewhat over time, she told him, though they'll always be visible. How are you doing otherwise? Any nightmares, anxiety, trouble sleeping? Peter hesitated, then admitted, I haven't been able to stay at my cabin overnight yet. I start feeling panicky when it gets dark. That's a normal reaction to trauma, she assured him. Some people develop a condition called acute stress disorder after frightening events. It usually resolves on its own within a month. But if you're still struggling after that, you might want to consider talking to someone professionally. Peter nodded, somewhat relieved to hear that his reaction wasn't unusual. I'm trying to take it slow, spend more time there each day. That's a good approach, Dr. Ramirez encouraged. Gradual exposure often helps overcome these kinds of fears. Just be patient with yourself. When the weekend arrived, Mark returned to his cabin, bringing fresh supplies and a sympathetic ear. Peter had made considerable progress on the cleanup, and the two men spent Saturday completing the remaining tasks. You know, Mark said as they worked, I was thinking about your security setup. Have you considered installing more comprehensive measures? Maybe a full alarm system or reinforced doors? I've thought about it, Peter admitted. Though part of the appeal of this place was its simplicity, being somewhat disconnected from all that technology. You can still have that, Mark suggested, but with an added layer of protection for peace of mind. The idea appealed to Peter. Perhaps the right upgrades would help bridge the gap between his desire to reclaim his sanctuary and his new wariness of its wild surroundings. That evening, as they sat on Mark's porch watching the sunset, Peter made a decision. I'm going to try staying at my place tomorrow night, he announced. Mark looked surprised but nodded supportively. Are you sure you're ready? No, Peter admitted with a small laugh, but I need to start somewhere. The longer I avoid it, the harder it will become. What's your plan? Mark asked practically. I thought I'd set up the telescope, do some stargazing like I intended that night, Peter explained. Face the fear head on, create a new memory to replace the traumatic one. That's a sound approach, Mark agreed. Would you like company? I could hang around, be nearby if you need anything. Peter considered the offer. Having Mark present would provide a safety net, but it might also prevent him from fully confronting his fear. I appreciate that, he said finally, but I think this is something I need to do on my own. I understand, Mark said, but I'll keep my phone on all night just in case. The next day passed in a flutter of nervous anticipation. Peter spent the morning researching security systems designed for remote properties, finding several options that would provide the protection he sought without detracting from the cabin's rustic charm. He placed an order for a system that included reinforced door frames, motion sensors that could distinguish between humans and wildlife, and a cellular-connected alarm. In the afternoon, he returned to his cabin, bringing supplies for the evening, a simple dinner that wouldn't produce strong cooking odors, bottled water, and his astronomy equipment. He meticulously checked and rechecked the security of doors and windows, placing a chair under the doorknob for added measure, despite knowing it was probably unnecessary. As the sun began to set, Peter set up his telescope on the deck, positioning it to observe Jupiter and Saturn, which would be visible later that night. The familiar routine of calibrating the equipment and checking his star charts helped calm his nerves, grounding him in an activity that had always brought joy and peace. Darkness fell, and with it came the expected anxiety. Every noise from the surrounding forest seemed magnified: the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night bird, the creak of the cabin settling. Peter found himself constantly scanning the tree line, expecting to see gleaming eyes reflecting back. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself after nearly jumping at the sound of a pine cone falling onto the roof. "The bear is gone. You're safe?" Forcing himself to focus on his telescope, Peter gradually became absorbed in the wonders of the night sky. The rings of Saturn were particularly clear tonight, and he spent nearly an hour observing and documenting their appearance in his astronomy journal. Around midnight, a new sound caught his attention, a rustling from the edge of the clearing. That was too substantial to be the wind. Peter froze, his hand tightening on the telescope's focus knob. Slowly, he turned toward the noise, heart pounding. A deer emerged from the trees, its movement triggering the motion-activated lights. The sudden illumination startled the animal, which bounded across the clearing and disappeared into the forest on the other side. Peter exhaled shakily, a surprised laugh escaping him. The encounter had frightened him momentarily, but it had also broken some of the tension he'd been carrying. The woods were full of wildlife, most of it harmless. He couldn't live in fear of every sound and movement. Returning to his observations, Peter continued stargazing until nearly 2 in the morning. When fatigue finally overtook him, he packed up his equipment and moved inside, double-checking the locks before attempting to sleep. Lying in his own bed for the first time since the attack, Peter found his mind racing, replaying the events. Save that night, the bear's huffing breath, the surprising grace of its movements, the searing pain as claws tore through his chest. He pressed a hand to his healing scars, feeling the raised lines beneath his t-shirt. Despite his exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. Peter tossed and turned, startling at every creak and settling sound the cabin made. Eventually he got up and moved to the living room couch, where he could see the front door and most of the windows. With the lights on and a book in hand, he finally dozed off in the early hours of the morning. The sound of birdsong woke him as sunlight streamed through the windows. Peter blinked, momentarily disoriented before remembering where he was. He had done it, spent the night in his cabin. It hadn't been restful or comfortable, but it was a start. Stretching carefully to avoid pulling at his healing wounds, Peter made his way to the kitchen to prepare coffee. The simple act of following his normal morning routine in his own space felt like a victory, a step toward reclaiming what the bear had taken from him. As he sipped his coffee on the deck, watching the forest come alive with morning activity, Peter reflected on the past 2 weeks. The attack had changed him. There was no denying that. He would always carry the physical scars, and perhaps some psychological ones as well. But he had survived, and now he was rebuilding, adapting. His phone rang, displaying Mark's number. "Morning," Peter answered. "Yes, I made it through the night." "Proud of you," Mark said. "How was it?" "Honestly, not great," Peter admitted. "Lots of jumping at shadows and not much sleep. But I did it, and that's what matters." "The first night is the hardest," Mark assured him. "It'll get easier." "I know," Peter said, and found that he believed it. "I ordered a security system yesterday. Should be installed next week." "Good move," Mark approved. "Any plans for today?" "I'm heading back to Boston this afternoon," Peter explained. "Doctor cleared me to return to the office tomorrow, but I'll be back next weekend." "Regular schedule resuming then?" "More or less," Peter confirmed, "though I might invest in a mini fridge for the deck so I can keep snacks out there during stargazing sessions. No more running back and forth to the kitchen." Mark chuckled, adapting to circumstances. That's what survival is all about. After the call, Peter packed his belongings for the return to Boston. As he was loading his car, Officer Thornton's truck pulled into the driveway. The wildlife officer stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Collins," he greeted Peter. "Good to see you back at your cabin. How are you healing?" "Getting there," Peter replied, gesturing to his chest. "Still sore, but the stitches are out." "Glad to hear it." Thornton glanced around the property. "I wanted to follow up, see if there had been any further bear activity in the area." "None that I've noticed," Peter told him. "Though I haven't been staying here consistently until last night." Thornton nodded. "We've had no reports of the relocated bear returning, which is a good sign. They generally avoid areas where they've had negative experiences, like being trapped." "That's reassuring," Peter said. "I've ordered a security system as an extra precaution." "Smart move," Thornton approved. "May I ask if this experience has changed your plans for the cabin? Some folks decide to sell after encounters like yours." Peter considered the question. The thought had crossed his mind in the immediate aftermath of the attack, but it had never seriously taken root. "I'm staying," he said firmly. "This place means too much to me to give it up over one bad experience. I'll just be more cautious going forward." "That's the right attitude," Thornton said with a smile. "Respect for wildlife doesn't mean we can't share the same spaces, just that we need to be aware of the risks and prepare accordingly." He handed Peter a pamphlet. "Some additional information on bear-proofing your property. There's a community meeting next month in Jackson about coexisting with local wildlife if you're interested." "I might attend," Peter said, tucking the pamphlet into his pocket. "Thanks for checking in." After Thornton departed, Peter finished loading his car and took one last look at his cabin before leaving. It remained his sanctuary, albeit a slightly modified one. The attack had been a harsh reminder of the wild nature that surrounded his peaceful retreat, but it hadn't diminished his love for the place or his determination to preserve his connection to it. The drive back to Boston gave Peter time to reflect on how to share his experience with colleagues and friends. He had already fielded numerous messages of concern after word of the attack spread through his social circle. Some responses had been appropriately sympathetic, while others veered into sensationalism, treating his ordeal as an exciting story rather than a traumatic event. How much should he share? Should he? The physical evidence of the attack was hidden beneath his clothing, the scars a private reminder that he could choose to reveal or conceal. There were no dramatic photographs, no video footage, only his word and the medical records documenting his injuries. By the time he reached his apartment in Cambridge, Peter had decided on a measured approach. He would acknowledge the attack when asked, provide basic facts without embellishment, and redirect conversations when they ventured into morbid curiosity or bear hunting anecdotes, which several acquaintances had already attempted to share. His return to the office the following day brought the expected flurry of attention. Colleagues he barely spoke to suddenly found reasons to pass by his desk, their expressions a mixture of concern and fascination. "Is it true you fought off a bear with your bare hands?" asked Ryan from accounting, leaning against Peter's cubicle wall with poorly concealed excitement. "Not exactly," Peter replied dryly. "It swiped at me, I ran, and motion sensor. Light scared it off. Less the revenant, more running away sensibly." "Still pretty badass," Ryan insisted. "Do you have pictures of the wounds?" Peter fixed him with a level stare. "No, and I wouldn't share them if I did." The directness of his response seemed to penetrate Ryan's obliviousness. "Right, sorry, that was insensitive. Glad you're okay." "Man." His supervisor, Eleanor, was more considerate, stopping by his desk with a genuine smile. "Welcome back, Peter. We missed you around here. How are you feeling?" "Better every day," he told her. "Thanks for being so flexible with the time off." "Of course," she said. "Let me know if you need any accommodations while you're recovering." The workday passed in a blur of catching up on missed developments and easing back into his regular tasks. By the time Peter returned to his apartment that evening, he was exhausted but satisfied with his re-entry to normal life. Over the following weeks, Peter established a new relationship with his New Hampshire property. He returned each weekend, gradually increasing his comfort level with both the cabin and its surroundings. The security system was installed, providing an additional layer of protection that helped ease his lingering anxiety. He began taking short walks in the woods surrounding his property, deliberately facing his newfound fear of the forest. Each successful excursion built his confidence, though he found himself far more alert to his surroundings than before the attack. The community meeting on wildlife coexistence, held in the Jackson Town Hall one rainy evening in late May, proved unexpectedly valuable. Peter sat in the back row, listening as experts from Fish and Game discussed the increasing frequency of human-wildlife interactions as development expanded into formerly wild areas. "Black bears are naturally shy and typically avoid humans," explained the presenter. a wildlife biologist with decades of field experience, but they're also intelligent and opportunistic. Once they associate human habitation with easy food sources, that natural wariness can be overcome by hunger. The presentation covered practical measures for reducing conflict, secure trash storage, bird feeder management during bear season, proper camping food techniques, many of which Peter had already implemented at his cabin. During the question and answer session, Peter found himself raising his hand. When called upon, he briefly described his experience, then asked, "How likely is it that a relocated bear would return to the same area?" "It depends on several factors," the biologist replied. "Distance of relocation, availability of food in the new location, and the bear's age and established patterns. We try to move bears at least 60 miles away, preferably with significant geographical barriers between the capture and release sites. But bears can travel remarkable distances, up to 100 miles or more if motivated." The answer wasn't entirely reassuring, but it reinforced Peter's decision to maintain heightened security measures. He thanked the biologist and settled back to listen to the remaining questions. After the meeting, several attendees approached Peter, having recognized his story from local news coverage. Most offered sympathy and shared their own less dramatic wildlife encounters. One elderly gentleman clapped him on the shoulder with surprising strength. "You've been initiated into the North Country Club now, son," he declared with a gap-toothed grin. "Got the badges to prove it." He tapped his own chest, where Peter presumed similar scars lay beneath his flannel shirt. "Not a club I was looking to join," Peter replied with a small smile. "None of us are," the old man said sagely. "But once you're in, you see things different. Respect the wild, don't fear it. Fear makes you do stupid things." The simple wisdom resonated with Peter. Fear had been his predominant emotion since the attack. Fear of the bear returning, fear of the forest, fear of his own vulnerability. But fear was a poor counselor, leading to either reckless bravado or paralyzing caution. Respect, on the other hand, acknowledged the danger while allowing for measured response. As spring gave way to summer, Peter's physical wounds healed to pink scars that would eventually fade to silver. The psychological healing progressed as well, though certain triggers, the particular sound of something heavy moving through underbrush or the unexpected appearance of wildlife near the cabin, could still send his heart racing. His stargazing continued, though with modified habits. Peter installed a small refrigerator on the deck for snacks and drinks, eliminating the need to go back inside during observation sessions. He kept doors and windows secured at all times, even during brief excursions outside. Food waste was stored in a bear-resistant container behind the garage until it could be properly disposed of. Word of his encounter spread through the local community, earning him a certain notoriety among year-round residents and fellow vacation property owners. Some viewed him with a mixture of sympathy and respect, while others seemed to consider the attack a result of city folk carelessness, a perspective Peter couldn't entirely dispute, given his mistake with the open door and unattended food. One unexpected outcome was an invitation from the local elementary school to speak to a fifth-grade class about wildlife safety. Initially hesitant, Peter eventually agreed, recognizing an opportunity to transform his experience into something educational. The children were predictably enthralled by his story, though Peter was careful to emphasize his mistakes and the proper precautions that might have prevented the encounter. When one wide-eyed boy asked if he could see the scars, Peter politely declined but described them factually, stripping away any glamour of the battle wounds. "The most important thing I learned," he told the class, "is that we're visitors in the bear's home, not the other way around. They're not monsters or villains. They're just animals trying to find food and survive, same as any creature. Our job is to make sure we don't accidentally invite them into dangerous situations where people could get hurt and bears might be killed as a result." The teacher beamed at his message, clearly relieved that he hadn't sensationalized the experience. After the presentation, she thanked him warmly. "That was perfect, Mr. Collins. So important for them to learn respect rather than fear." As summer progressed, bear sightings in the area increased, a normal seasonal pattern, Officer Thornton assured Peter during a follow-up visit. None matched the description of Peter's bear, and no further incidents occurred at his property, though a weekend resident half a mile down the road reported finding his bird feeder destroyed and garbage cans upended. "Classic example of why we recommend taking feeders down from April through November," Thornton commented when he stopped by to inform Peter of the incident. "How are you doing with your security measures?" "So far so good," Peter reported. "The motion sensors have been triggered a few times by deer and once by what was probably a fox, but no bears." "Excellent," Thornton nodded approvingly. "Your story, by the way, has become something of a teaching moment for us. I've been using it in our public education sessions as an example of both what not to do and how to respond appropriately after an incident." Peter wasn't sure how he felt about being a cautionary tale, but if his experience helped prevent similar encounters, he could accept the role. By late August, with the peak of summer heat beginning to wane, Peter had established a new normal. The anxiety that had initially accompanied each visit to his cabin had faded to a background awareness, a heightened caution that informed his actions without controlling them. During a particularly clear night, Peter found himself once again tracking Saturn through his telescope. The planet's rings were displayed in stunning detail, the view remarkably similar to the one he'd been enjoying before the attack nearly 4 months earlier. As he adjusted the focus, Peter became aware of movement at the edge of the clearing. His hand tensed on the telescope, but he deliberately kept his breathing steady as he slowly straightened and turned toward the disturbance. A large black bear stood at the tree line, its form barely visible in the darkness beyond the reach of the cabin's lights. For a moment, Peter wondered if it was the same animal, somehow returned from its distant relocation. There was no way to know for certain. One black bear looked much like another to his untrained eye. The bear sniffed the air, perhaps catching Peter's scent. Unlike their previous encounter, however, there was no food smell to override the bear's natural caution around humans. After a few moments of consideration, the animal turned and melted back into the forest, apparently deciding that nothing in the clearing warranted the risk of approaching. Peter remained still, heart pounding but mind clear. When he was certain the bear had departed, he permitted himself a deep breath. Rather than fear, he felt a complex mixture of awe, respect, and a strange sense of closure. The encounter lasted less than a minute, but it represented something significant. The bear, whether his bear or another, had assessed the situation and chosen to avoid conflict. Peter had maintained his composure, acknowledging the potential danger without surrendering to panic. Both had acted appropriately within the context of their shared environment. Later that night, as Peter prepared for bed in his secure cabin, he ran his fingers absently over the scars on his chest. They had healed well, though they would always remain visible, a permanent record of his encounter with one of nature's most impressive and misunderstood creatures. The attack had changed him, certainly. He was more cautious, more prepared, more aware of his surroundings, but it hadn't broken his connection to this place, to the stars above or the forest around him. If anything, that connection had deepened, enriched by a newfound understanding of his place within the complex ecosystem he had chosen to inhabit. Outside, the forest continued its nighttime activities, nocturnal creatures hunting, foraging, surviving. Somewhere among them, a black bear moved through the darkness, following the ancient imperatives of its species. Their paths had crossed once in unfortunate circumstances, but now each had the knowledge to ensure such crossings remained. Rare and respectful, Peter turned out the light and closed his eyes, ready for dreams of stars rather than teeth and claws. Tomorrow would bring another day of coexistence, another opportunity to appreciate the wild beauty of New Hampshire from behind his reinforced door and improved security system. It was a compromise he could live with, had to live with, to maintain his small place in the woods. The bear, for its part, continued its journey through the forest, away from the strange structure with its unfamiliar scents and bright lights. It had learned something too, that some opportunities carried risks, not worth the potential reward. There were easier meals to be found in the bountiful summer woods, sources of food that didn't involve confrontation with the peculiar two-legged creatures and their unpredictable ways. As dawn approached, the bear settled into a comfortable hollow beneath an old oak tree, miles from Peter's cabin. It would move on tomorrow, following the rhythm of seasons and instincts that had guided its kind for thousands of years, long before humans built their cabins and gazed at stars through tubes of metal and glass. The brief intersection of their lives, dramatic as it had been for Peter, was already fading from the bear's simpler consciousness, replaced by more immediate concerns of hunger, shelter, and survival. And so they continued, man and bear, sharing the landscape while walking separate paths, connected by a momentary encounter that had marked one permanently and the other hardly at all. In the grand tapestry of the White Mountains, it was but a single thread, Yet for Peter Collins it had become the pivot around which his understanding of wildness, resilience, and coexistence now turned. His scars would fade further with time, but the lessons etched beneath them would remain, as enduring as the ancient forest itself.